When Grayson Reed walked into the Harwick Elite auction house that Saturday morning, wearing a flannel shirt and boots with dried mud still on the heel, the room didn't go quiet. It barely noticed him at all. That was the thing about men like Grayson. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. But when Lot 47 rolled under the lights, a ruined, rust-eaten wreck that looked like it had been dragged out of a riverbed, and Grayson raised his paddle for $500, the laughter started. And when Vanessa Sterling, CEO of Harwick Luxury Holdings, leaned into her microphone and said, "Well, someone has to take out the trash," the whole room went with her. What nobody understood yet, not Vanessa, not the bidders in their tailored suits, not the broker who'd submitted the paperwork, was that Grayson had just bought the most valuable thing in the building. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Harwick Elite Auction House sat on the corner of Meridian and 5th in downtown Ashford, Connecticut, inside a building that used to be a rail freight terminal before someone with money and taste decided old brick and exposed steel beams made rich people feel more comfortable spending money. The ceilings were high, the lighting was warm, and the catalog was printed on paper that felt like it cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. Everything about the place was designed to signal that you belonged, or that you didn't. Grayson Reed arrived at 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before the preview doors opened. He drove a 1994 Ford F-150 that had close to 200,000 miles on it and a passenger side door that only opened from the inside. He parked it in the loading zone around back because the front lot was valet only, and he had no intention of handing his keys to a college kid in a red vest. He sat in the cab for a moment with a folded paper catalog in his lap, the public one they'd mailed out 3 weeks ago, not the expanded, glossy version they handed to registered bidders. And he drank the last of his gas station coffee while he looked at the building. He wasn't nervous. He'd been to auctions like this before, though not recently, and not dressed any better than he was now. The flannel was clean. The boots were his good ones, even if they didn't look it. He'd learned a long time ago that clothes were what you wore when you wanted people to see you. Grayson generally preferred the opposite. He flipped to page 31 of the catalog, Lot 47. The photograph they'd printed was a single image, taken from maybe 10 feet away with what looked like a phone camera, in bad light, angled slightly downward, as if the photographer had been in a hurry. The car, what remained of it, sat low and crushed in the frame. The roof had been caved in on the driver's side. The hood was crumpled in a way that suggested it had met something immovable at speed. The rear quarter panel on the left was peeled away from the body like an orange rind. There was rust in 3 places visible even in the bad photo, and the whole thing sat on bare wheel hubs because whatever wheels had been on it were long gone. The description read, 1970s European touring coupe, make uncertain, significant structural and cosmetic damage, non-running, sold as is for parts or project. No title on file, documentation pending. No title, no make, documentation pending. Most people reading that would see a junk car, a liability, something you'd need a flatbed and a tetanus shot to deal with. Grayson had looked at that photograph for a long time when the catalog arrived. He'd looked at it under his desk lamp with a magnifying glass, which he understood sounded ridiculous, but that was the kind of thing you did when you'd spent 22 years putting broken cars back together and you started noticing the things that shouldn't fit. The roofline, even caved in, had a particular rake to it that didn't match the decade the listing suggested. The way the remaining bodywork curved at the C-pillar, you could barely see it in the photo. It was just a shadow, really. Wasn't something American manufacturers were doing in that era. The wheel arches, what he could see of them under the damage, had a flare that was subtle in a way mass-market cars weren't. It might have been nothing. He knew that. It probably was nothing. But he'd driven 4 hours round trip to find out. The preview room was set up along the south wall of the main auction floor, cars positioned under individual spotlights like museum pieces, which most of them were. A 1962 Ferrari 250 GTE, a Porsche 356 Speedster in aquamarine blue that had been restored so perfectly it looked like a photograph of itself. An early AC Cobra with matching numbers that had been valued pre-auction at a number Grayson tried not to think about. Beautiful machines, all of them, attended by men in dark suits who hovered near each car with the practiced stillness of gallery guards. Lot 47 was at the end of the row, past the last spotlight, in a corner near a fire exit where the nice lighting didn't quite reach. Someone had positioned it so the worst damage, the caved roof, the destroyed front end, faced the wall. Grayson stood a few feet from it for a moment, just looking. In person, it was worse than the photo. That was usually how it went. The car was covered in the kind of grime that took years to accumulate, the kind that filled every seam and settled into every scratch until the original surfaces disappeared under it. Whatever color it had been was gone. What remained was a flat, oxidized gray with brown rust bleeding through in the worst spots. The windshield was gone. The interior, what little he could see of it, was gutted. Seats removed, wiring torn out, the dash cracked and weather-beaten from exposure. He crouched beside the driver's rear quarter and looked at the body seam where the panel met the sill. He stayed there for a while. You know, the preview is more of a walkthrough situation. He looked up. One of the suits was standing nearby. Young guy, mid-20s, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up without having to try very hard at anything. "I'm previewing," Grayson said. "Sure, but..." The young man glanced at the car, then back at Grayson, doing the mental math of flannel shirt plus bad car plus excessive crouching. "That one's basically a parts car, if that. We actually debated pulling it from the catalog." "Why didn't you?" "Because someone has to buy the ugly ones, I guess." He smiled like it was a joke they were sharing. Grayson looked back at the body seam. "Who submitted the documentation?" "Sorry?" "The listing says documentation pending. Who's the submitting broker?" The young man's smile adjusted slightly. "I'd have to check." "That's fine, I'll wait." The man walked away and didn't come back. Grayson spent another 20 minutes with the car, moving around it slowly, crouching and standing and looking at angles that probably seemed pointless to anyone watching. He ran his fingers along the door sill where the rocker panel had partially separated. He looked at what remained of the engine bay through the gap in the crumpled hood. He found one small piece of the firewall that hadn't been touched by the damage or the rust, where the original factory stampings were still faintly visible beneath decades of grime, and he took out his phone and photographed it 3 times from different angles. Then he went to register as a bidder. The woman at the registration desk had the particular kind of pleasant expression that people develop after years of being professionally pleasant to everyone, regardless of whether they deserve it. "Name?" "Reed, Grayson Reed." She typed, looked at her screen. "Do you have your registration deposit?" "I do." He handed over an envelope. She opened it, counted the cashier's check, and the pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. The check was larger than she'd expected from the flannel shirt. "Lot interest?" 47. She typed again. "Just the one?" "Just the one." She printed his bidder card and slid it across the counter with a yellow lanyard. "The auction begins at 10. Lot 47 is toward the end of the order. Probably late morning, early afternoon." "I figured." He found a seat near the back of the main floor and sat with his arms folded and his bidder card on his knee and watched the room fill up around him. The Harwick auction drew a specific kind of crowd. There were the serious collectors. You could identify them because they moved through the preview room like they were irritated to be there, which was the way people acted when they genuinely knew what they were looking at and had opinions about it. There were the dealers, working in pairs, talking quietly, occasionally photographing lots on their phones. There were the enthusiasts, a little younger, a little more obviously excited, wearing their knowledge more visibly. And there were the spectators, people who came because they could afford the registration deposit and the entry fee, and they liked being in a room where expensive things happened. Vanessa Sterling arrived at 9:50. Grayson noticed her because the room noticed her, the way a room notices someone who expects to be noticed, and has engineered their entrance accordingly. She came through the main doors with 2 people close behind her, an assistant with a tablet, and a man in a suit who looked like he handled things that needed handling. She was dressed sharply in navy blue, her dark hair pulled back, her heels clicking against the restored hardwood in a way that carried across the room. She was probably 40, maybe slightly past it, with the kind of maintained appearance that reflected either significant effort or significant money, or, more likely, both. She ran the Harwick Group, which owned the auction house and two other similar venues on the East Coast. She appeared in trade publications and occasionally in the lifestyle sections of financial magazines. She had opinions about the automotive collecting world, and she shared them publicly and often. She had built Harwick from a mid-tier regional auction into something that serious collectors took seriously, and she was apparently both proud of this and occasionally ruthless in protecting it. Grayson knew who she was, the way he knew who most prominent people in the industry were, by reputation, not by personal acquaintance. He watched her make her way through the room, stopping to greet people, touching arms, laughing at the right moments. She paused at several of the preview lots and said things that made people nearby nod. She was good at the room, he'd give her that. She didn't look at lot 47, Schaumet. The auction began at 10:15, which was 15 minutes late, which nobody seemed to mind because the champagne and the coffee were both still flowing at the refreshment table near the east wall. The auctioneer was a small, precise man named Dalton, who had been doing this for 20 years and had the unhurried, rhythmic efficiency of someone who understood that the pacing of a room was everything. He moved through the early lots with a comfortable confidence, and the room responded. The Ferrari went for $1.4 million to a telephone bidder. The Porsche went to a man in a gray suit sitting 2 rows ahead of Grayson, who raised his paddle with the resigned expression of someone who had already known he was going to do it. The Cobra went for more than its pre-auction estimate, and there was a brief, contained moment of collective excitement when the hammer fell. Grayson watched all of it without moving. He drank water. He read through the catalog notes. He waited. Lot 47 came up at 11:48. 2 men with Harwick jackets pushed the wreck into position on the floor with more effort than it deserved, and a few people in the crowd turned to look at it with the particular expression people make when something genuinely ugly appears in a place full of beautiful things. There were a couple of murmured comments. Someone near the front laughed at something their neighbor said. Lot 47, Dalton said, with the same tone he'd used for the Ferrari and the Cobra and every other lot before it. A European touring coupe, 1970s production, extensive damage, sold as is with no title. Documentation is currently pending submission to the registry. Will start at $200. Silence. Which was expected. Nobody wanted this car. It wasn't really even a car anymore. It was an object that had once been a car, and the gap between those two things was visible from 20 feet away. $200, Dalton said again. Anyone? Grayson raised his paddle. 200 to the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 250? Nobody heard 250. 300? Dalton tried. His voice remained completely even because Dalton was a professional. Grayson kept his paddle up. I'll take 300 from the same bidder. Any advance on 300? Dalton waited 5 seconds, which in an auction room was a fairly long time. 400? 350? Nothing. Going once at 300? 500. The voice came from Grayson. He hadn't raised his paddle again. He'd just spoken, which wasn't technically how bidding worked, but which Dalton accommodated without blinking, because the bid was going up rather than down, and that was the important thing. $500, Dalton confirmed. Going once, going twice. The hammer fell. There was a beat of silence, and then, from somewhere near the front, from the raised platform where Vanessa Sterling had been seated since the auction began, with her assistant in her suit beside her, there was a sound. A short, sharp sound. A laugh. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. The kind of laugh that escapes before you've decided whether to let it out. But it was audible, and once it was out, a few other people took the permission it offered, and the room had a moment of general amusement at the man in the flannel shirt who'd spent $500 on something that wasn't worth $200. Vanessa leaned slightly toward her microphone. She had one because she sometimes made remarks between lots, which was a signature of Harwick events, and said, with a dry amusement that was clearly meant to land well, someone has to take out the trash. The room appreciated it. Not uproariously. These were not uproarious people, but enough. A ripple of laughter. A few smiles. The man next to Grayson, who had come to the auction in the kind of watch that cost more than Grayson's truck, glanced over at him with an expression that was somewhere between pity and amusement. Grayson put his bidder card in his shirt pocket. He was already thinking about the firewall stamps. Loading the car took 40 minutes, and the better part of Grayson's patience, because the flatbed he'd arranged came with a driver who had opinions about the correct method of winching a vehicle with no wheels and no structural integrity, and felt compelled to share all of them. "This thing's not going to make it off the truck without losing something," the driver said, for the third time. "I know," Grayson said for the third time. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying, Carl. You sure you want this thing?" Grayson looked at the car on the flatbed, even loaded and strapped, even wrapped in the soft shame of its condition and the freshly attached Harwick purchase tag. It had that roofline. It had those wheel arches. It had the thing he'd seen in the catalog photograph at midnight 3 weeks ago and driven 4 hours to confirm with his own hands. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." Carl shrugged in the expressive way of men who are paid not to argue and climbed back into the cab. Grayson was walking toward his truck when someone behind him said, "Excuse me." He turned. It was the young suit from the preview room, minus some of his earlier confidence. "I found the broker information you were asking about this morning." Grayson waited. The documentation on Lot 47 was submitted by a firm called Caldwell Provenance Services. The young man paused, as if deciding how much to say. "They're a reputable outfit. They handle a lot of our import documentation. I wanted you to know, in case there are any issues with the title transfer." "Were there issues?" "No, I mean, the documentation is pending, like the listing said, but that's not unusual for vehicles in this condition without clear ownership history. It should clear in a few weeks." Grayson nodded slowly. "What's your name?" "Marcus. Marcus Vale. I'm in the authentication department." "Marcus." Grayson looked at him. "When the documentation comes in from Caldwell, I'd like a copy. You're the buyer, so you'll receive the standard paperwork. I'd like the full submission, whatever they sent in, not just the buyer summary." Marcus looked uncertain. "I'd need to check with whoever you need to check with." Grayson handed him a business card, plain white, name and phone number, nothing else. "Call me when you have it." He got in his truck and followed the flatbed out of the Harwick lot without looking back. Reed Restoration occupied a converted barn on 4 acres outside a small town called Collowick, about 40 miles north of Ashford. The barn had been there since the 1940s, and Grayson had bought the property 9 years ago when the previous owner, an elderly man who'd used it for actual farming, decided he was done with actual farming. It took Grayson 2 winters to get the building properly insulated and wired, and another year after that to outfit it the way he needed. The shop had 4 bays. 2 were occupied. A 1967 Alfa Romeo Spider that had been waiting on a transmission component from Italy for 6 weeks, and a 71 Jaguar E-Type in the early stages of a full restoration for a client in Boston who called every 10 days to ask about progress. The other 2 bays were clear. He pulled the car into the 3rd bay on Sunday morning, after the flatbed had dropped it the evening before. He'd left it sitting overnight, which he always did with new arrivals, because the first look you got at a thing in motion, loading, unloading, positioning, wasn't the same as the look you got at it standing still. He stood in the bay doorway with a mug of coffee for a while, just looking. In the bay lighting, which was excellent, he'd spent more on the lighting than on the insulation, the car looked worse than it had at Harwick and worse than it had in the photograph. The damage had its own logic when you could see it clearly. The front end had gone into something solid, and the energy had distributed itself up through the hood and into the A-pillars and then the roof. The car had been hit hard, and it had been hit fast. The left rear quarter damage was different, older, the rust deeper, suggesting that it had happened separately and probably years before whatever ended the car's driving life. The more he looked, the more certain he became. He set his coffee on the work table and started with photographs. He photographed every panel, every seam, every inch of visible structural damage, every surviving detail. He photographed the firewall stamps he'd seen at the auction with better equipment this time, and he spent 20 minutes on those alone, adjusting the angle of a handheld light until the faint stampings resolved into something readable. What he saw made him stop. He sat on a rolling stool and looked at the photographs on his phone for a long time without moving. Then he called the only person he knew who might be able to tell him whether he was right or wrong without immediately telling someone else about it. "Ray," he said when the call connected. "Grayson Reed." Raymond Chu's voice had the permanently amused quality of a man who found most of life entertaining. He was 63, a former museum conservator who now ran a small automotive authentication practice out of a cluttered office in Philadelphia. He'd known Grayson for 15 years and trusted his instincts the way you trusted someone who had never yet been wrong about anything that mattered. "You just bought something interesting, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. "Maybe," Grayson said. "Send me your encrypted email. It's the same as it's always been." "Send it anyway." He heard Ray laughing as he hung up. Oh, he sent the photographs that night. 14 images, selected carefully, including the firewall stamps and 3 detail shots of the surviving bodywork at the C-pillar and the rear wheel arch. Ray called back at 6 the next morning. "Tell me what you think you have," Ray said. "I think the body construction doesn't match the listed decade. I think the roofline is wrong for a mass production vehicle of the era. I think the wheel arch geometry—" "Tell me what you think you have, Grayson." Grayson leaned against the workbench. "The stamp sequence on the firewall. I can only read part of it, but the format is consistent with a limited series production code, not a standard production run." Silence on Ray's end. "The car is listed as 1970s European touring coupe, make uncertain," Grayson continued. "Which is what you'd say about a car if you either didn't know what it was or didn't want anyone to find out." And which do you think it is?" "I think someone knew exactly what it was." Another silence. Then Ray said, "The C-pillar photograph, the third one you sent." "Yeah. That radius. That's not something you see on production vehicles." "No." "And the sill profile in image 7. "I know." "Grayson." Ray's voice had shifted. The permanent amusement was still there, but something had settled beneath it, something heavier. "If you're right about this, I know. Do you understand what I'm saying? If the stamp sequence reads the way I think it might read, and if the body characteristics hold up under physical examination, Ray, I know," Grayson said. "That's why I called you and not someone else." A long pause. "I can be there Thursday." "I know you can. Come Wednesday." He spent Monday and Tuesday doing what he could do alone, which was less than he wanted to do and more than most people would have known to do. He carefully removed the worst of the surface grime from the firewall, using a process that took 4 hours and involved more patience than most restoration work he'd done. He didn't clean. Cleaning destroyed information, he revealed. He worked in millimeters using soft brushes and controlled solvents, photographing at every stage, treating the car less like a restoration project and more like an archaeological site. By Tuesday afternoon, he could read 60% of the firewall stamp sequence. He sat with his notebook and a magnifying glass and a printed reference page he'd ordered from a specialist archive 3 years ago for a different job that had turned out to be a different job entirely. He compared characters. He checked the spacing. He went over it 3 times before he wrote anything down. What he wrote down was a number. He looked at the number for a long time. Then he turned the notebook face down on the workbench, went inside his house, which sat about 30 feet from the barn, and made himself eat something for dinner because he hadn't eaten since that morning, and his hands were starting to feel less reliable than he needed them to be. He ate standing at the kitchen counter, leftover pasta, cold, which he'd made 4 days ago and hadn't gotten around to properly reheating. And he looked out the window at the barn where the light was still on over Bay 3. He thought about the woman at the microphone. The dry, easy laugh. Someone has to take out the trash. He wasn't angry about it. He understood how the world worked, and he understood that people made assessments based on what they could see, and what she'd been able to see was a man in a flannel shirt raising a paddle for a destroyed car. Her read of the situation wasn't wrong, exactly. It was just incomplete. He finished the pasta, rinsed the bowl, and went back to the barn. Ray Chu arrived Wednesday morning in a silver sedan that had a dent in the rear quarter that he'd had for at least 4 years and seemed entirely untroubled by. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and white hair that he'd mostly given up trying to manage, and he came into the barn with a rolling case of equipment and the manner of someone who had been looking at cars for 40 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what he found. He stood in front of the car for exactly 1 minute without saying anything. Then he turned to Grayson. "You found this at the Harwick auction?" "Yes." "In Ashford?" "Yeah." Ray looked back at the car. "And the listing?" "European touring coupe, 1970s, make uncertain." "Make uncertain." He said it quietly to himself. Right. He opened his rolling case and put on magnification glasses that made him look slightly alarming and got to work. Grayson left him alone. He went to the Alfa Romeo and continued working on the transmission. He could hear Ray moving around the bay, the soft metallic sounds of tools being picked up and set down, the occasional murmur of someone talking to themselves through a problem. But he didn't interrupt. Ray worked the way Grayson worked, slowly and with full attention and without hurrying toward a conclusion before the evidence was ready to give one. At noon, Ray came and found him. "Let's go inside," Ray said. They sat at Grayson's kitchen table, which had a collection of reference books and parts catalogs and coffee-stained notepads that occupied roughly half its surface. Ray put his glasses on the table and pressed his fingers together and looked at the tabletop for a moment. "Okay," he said. "What's your number?" Grayson told him the number from his notebook. Ray nodded slowly. "That matches what I'm reading on the firewall, which means, if the registry records are what I think they are," he stopped. "Grayson, you need to understand that I am not going to say what I think until I have done a full physical analysis, because this is not the kind of thing you say before you're certain. I know that. And even then, we're going to need at least 2 independent confirmations before I know that too." Ray looked at him. "Are you prepared for this to be nothing? Because it might be nothing. The stamp sequence could be a reproduction. The body characteristics could be coincidental. The damage could be concealing problems that rule out." "Ray?" Grayson met his eyes. "I've been in this business for 22 years. I've been wrong before. I know what it feels like to be wrong, and I know what this feels like, and it doesn't feel the same." A long pause. Ray picked up his glasses and turned them over in his hands. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't feel the same to me either." What it felt like, specifically, was this. The car in Bay 3 of Reed Restoration, the car that had been rolled out at the Harwick auction to general indifference and had sold for $500 to a man in a flannel shirt, appeared, pending full verification, to be one of an extremely limited series of vehicles produced in a specific window of time by a manufacturer that had existed briefly, brilliantly, and then stopped existing. The series had been produced in a number so small that the automotive world had assumed most of them were gone. One had been confirmed in a museum in Europe. 2 had sold at major international auctions in the past decade for numbers that made the financial press. The rest were believed lost to time, to neglect, to the ordinary attrition of machines that weren't treated as the remarkable things they were. The car Grayson had bought for $500 might be one of the rest. He didn't tell anyone this. Not yet. He went back to the barn after Ray left. Ray was going to his office to begin pulling registry records and archive documentation, a process that would take weeks, and he stood in front of the car in the overhead light of Bay 3 and looked at it for a long time. The damage was real. The rust was real. The years of neglect and the violence of whatever accident had ended its road life were all real and present and undeniable. This was not a car anyone would look at and see anything but a wreck. But Grayson had spent his whole adult life learning to look past what things appeared to be. He put his hand on the door sill, so gently, the way you touch something that might be fragile, and he thought about what was underneath all of it. The original metal, the original lines. Whatever color it had been built in, the paint that still existed in microscopic layers beneath the rust and the grime and the decades. He had a lot of work to do. He went to get his tools. 3 days after the auction, Grayson received an email from a Harwick Group address he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Follow-up from preview, M. Vale." The email was short. Marcus had checked with his supervisor about providing the full Caldwell Provenance Services submission. His supervisor had said the standard buyer summary was all that was available to purchasers. He apologized for the inconvenience. He hoped Grayson was enjoying his purchase. At the bottom of the email, below the Harwick Group logo and Marcus's professional signature block, there was a single line of personal text that hadn't been formatted into the email template. "For what it's worth, I pulled the submission myself. There are some things in the documentation that didn't look right to me. I'm not sure what to do with that." Grayson read the last 2 sentences 3 times. Then he replied with 2 words. "Call me." His phone rang 4 hours later. Meanwhile, In an office on the 14th floor of the Harwick Group's Ashford headquarters, Vanessa Sterling was looking at a piece of paper that was giving her a headache. She hadn't thought about Lot 47 since the auction. Why would she? It had sold for $500 to a man she'd embarrassed in front of a room full of people, and that had been the end of it. She had other things to manage. 2 upcoming auctions, a potential acquisition of a competing venue in Boston, 3 ongoing disputes with consignors about reserve prices, and a profile piece for a trade publication that she'd pushed back twice and was running out of excuses to push back again. The piece of paper was a standard provenance audit, a random sample her authentication department ran quarterly, checking a selection of recent lot submissions against known registry databases. The audit had flagged something. Not in Lot 47. In the documentation surrounding Lot 47, specifically in the brokerage submission from Caldwell Provenance Services, which had been submitted 14 days before the auction, and which had listed the vehicle's provenance as uncertain, likely salvage acquisition, Central European origin. The flag was technical. A registration document number that appeared in the Caldwell submission didn't match the format used by any registry Harwick's system recognized. It wasn't a forgery flag, exactly. It was an anomaly flag. The kind of thing that got generated and reviewed and usually turned out to be a data entry error or a formatting difference between international registry systems. Usually. Vanessa looked at the flag number for a while. Then she picked up her phone and called her head of authentication. "The Caldwell submission on Lot 47, she said. "Walk me through it." A pause on the other end. "That lot already sold, Ms. Sterling." "I know it already sold. Walk me through the submission." Another pause, longer. "I'll need to pull the file." "Pull it." She set the phone down and looked out her 14th floor window at downtown Ashford, which was doing what downtown Ashford always did in late October, going gray and brown as the last of the leaves came down and the cold settled in. The thing about her job, the thing she had learned slowly and only through mistakes, was that the reputation of an auction house was exactly as strong as its documentation process. You could have the most beautiful catalog, the most prestigious consignors, the most sophisticated bidders. All of it collapsed the moment someone found out you'd sold something that wasn't what it was supposed to be, or wasn't supposed to be what it was. She pulled the Caldwell submission up on her computer herself before her authentication head called back. And as she read through it, actually read it, for the first time, rather than relying on the department's summary clearance, she felt the specific, unpleasant sensation of something being wrong in a way she couldn't yet fully articulate. She was still reading when her phone rang again. She let it ring. The phone Marcus Vail used to call Grayson was not his work phone. That detail registered immediately when Grayson picked up and heard the slightly over-careful quality in the younger man's voice, the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the first sentence 3 times and was now delivering it and trying not to sound like they had. "I wanted to make sure this was a personal call," Marcus said, "not a Harwick call." "Understood," Grayson said, "because I don't want to overstate what I saw. It might be nothing. It probably is nothing. I'm not a documentation specialist. I'm more on the physical authentication side, and this was outside my—" "Marcus," Grayson set down the wrench he'd been holding. "Just tell me what you saw." A breath on the other end. The Caldwell submission had 3 supporting documents: a salvage record, an import declaration, and a provenance attestation. Those are standard for a vehicle with no clear title history. You need at least 2 of the 3 for us to list the lot, and having all 3 is actually better than most distressed condition submissions we receive. Okay. The salvage record was fine. I checked the format. It matched the issuing agency's standard template. The record number was in sequence with other records from the same period. Nothing unusual. The import declaration was also clean. He paused. The provenance attestation is the 3rd document. It's basically a written statement from the broker confirming they've investigated the vehicle's history to the best of their ability and are representing its provenance honestly. Standard broker language. Yes, exactly. And most of the time, those documents are templated. Caldwell submits maybe 15 to 20 lots a year with us, so we know their format, we know their language. This one used the same template. Another pause. Longer. Except for one line. In the section where they describe the vehicle's origin chain, the sequence of ownership as best as they can establish it, There's a reference to a transfer of ownership from a named estate in Central Europe. Grayson was very still. What name? Albrecht, the Albrecht estate. The name meant something to him immediately, and it was not a small something. He sat with it for a second. Grayson, Marcus said, does that mean something to you? Maybe. Keep going. The thing is, and this is what I couldn't get out of my head, I've seen the Albrecht name before. Not in a submission, but in an archive document my department keeps for reference. It's on a short list of known collector estates with documented connections to significant vehicles that have been reported missing or unaccounted for since the 80s. It's not a fraud flag exactly. It's more of a watch list is too strong a word. An awareness list. Who maintains that list? We do. Internally. The authentication department. It was started by the previous department head before I joined. Most of the estates on it are benign, yet they're just names that come up in connection with disputed provenance claims, and documenting them doesn't mean anything fraudulent happened. But it's a flag. Yes, in my opinion, which is why I checked to see if the Albrecht reference had been noted in the submission review. A beat. It hadn't. The submission was cleared without anyone catching it. Grayson rubbed the back of his neck. Outside the barn windows, the afternoon was going gray, the light flattening. He could hear the wind picking up against the north wall. Marcus, why are you telling me this? The question sat on the line between them for a moment. Because you bought that car, Marcus said finally, and you asked questions before the auction that nobody else was asking. And I work in authentication, which means I'm supposed to care when something doesn't look right. And mostly I do care. I don't always know what to do with it when I find it. You're telling me, Grayson said. That's what you're doing with it. Yeah. A short, uncertain laugh. I guess I am. Okay. Grayson looked across the bay at the car under its work lights. Don't do anything else with it yet. Don't file anything. Don't flag it internally. Don't talk to your supervisor about it. It might be nothing. You said yourself it might be nothing. Before you put something formal into motion at a company that employs you, let me figure out what I actually have here. A pause. How long? Few weeks. Maybe less. Okay, Marcus said. He didn't sound entirely comfortable with it, but he said it anyway. Okay. The Albrecht name sent Grayson to his reference library, which occupied 3 shelves along the south wall of his workshop office and was organized in a system that made complete sense to him and would have made no sense to anyone else. He spent 2 hours that evening going through archive catalogs, production records, and collector correspondence that he'd accumulated over 22 years of doing this work, some of it photocopied from documents he'd seen at museums and private collections, some of it scanned and printed from specialist databases, some of it, the older, more obscure material, purchased from estate sales and defunct dealers who hadn't known what they had. He found the Albrecht reference in a collector correspondence archive from the early 90s, a photocopy of a letter written in German that he'd had partially translated years ago for a different inquiry. The letter was from a collector to an Austrian dealer, discussing the disposition of a small private collection following the death of a family member. One paragraph mentioned a vehicle that had been part of the collection for many years, noted as having come to the family through a private sale in the 1960s, and described in terms that were both vague enough to protect the seller's privacy and specific enough that Grayson, reading it now, felt something tighten in his chest. He sat with that letter until close to midnight. Then he photographed it, sent the image to Ray with a single line of text, check the Albrecht connection in your registry research, and went to bed. He didn't sleep particularly well. No. Ray called at 7 the next morning, which was unusual because Ray generally didn't reach full cognitive function until after his second coffee, which he took at 9. The registry research, Ray said, without preamble. Yeah. There's a gap. Ray's voice had that quality again. The humor still present, but subordinate to something else. In the production records for the series we're looking at, there are documented examples whose histories can be traced through to the present. And then there are the ones that fall off the record at various points. Most of those we can account for: known accidents, documented destructions, museum acquisitions, confirmed sales with traceable chains. And the ones you can't account for. 3 vehicles, whose last confirmed documentation places them in European private collections in the late 70s and early 80s, after which they simply stop appearing in any record. 3. 3. A pause. Grayson, one of those 3 has a provenance trail that includes a private sale in the mid-60s to a collector family in Central Europe. The family name in the records is Albrecht. The barn was quiet around him. Through the window he could see the morning coming up flat and pale over the tree line, the kind of October morning that couldn't decide whether to be beautiful or bleak. So the car in my bay, Grayson said carefully, could be a vehicle that left the documented record in approximately 1981 and hasn't appeared since. Could be. Could also be a different car with a similar history. I need more data. The physical examination I did was preliminary, so I need to come back with better equipment and more time. And we need those firewall stamps fully read. The partial sequence you have isn't enough. I know. There's something else, Ray said. I called a colleague at the International Registry last night. I didn't give him specifics. I framed it as a general inquiry about the Albrecht estate's documentation history. He told me that the estate's records have been the subject of 2 separate provenance inquiries in the past 15 years. Both were resolved without any formal findings. Resolved how? He didn't know, or didn't want to say. A beat. Which is its own kind of answer. Grayson looked at the car through the office window. From this angle, he could see the line of the surviving roof, the way it swept back from the damaged A-pillar. And even now, even knowing everything he was learning, that line did something to him. There was an intelligence in it, a purposefulness. Someone had thought very hard about that curve. Come back Friday, he said. I'll be there Thursday evening. Bring the spectrometer. I was already planning to bring the spectrometer, Grayson. I know. I just wanted to say it. He heard Ray exhale in a way that was almost a laugh. Thursday evening. Don't touch the firewall area before I get there. I know how to do my job, Ray. I know you do. That's why I said it. He spent Wednesday alone with the car, doing the work he could do without risking the evidence he needed to preserve. The first phase of any serious restoration, the phase before you touched anything, before you cut or ground or welded or painted, was documentation. Not just photography, though photography was continuous and obsessive. It was mapping, understanding the topology of the damage, where it started, how it moved, what it had done to the structure beneath. The difference between surface damage and structural damage. The difference between what looked destroyed and what actually was. Grayson worked with a systematic patience that he'd developed over years and that no one had taught him. He'd taught himself, through jobs that went wrong when he moved too fast and jobs that went right when he didn't. He marked the car in sections using a system of numbered tags, photographed each section from multiple angles, and kept a written log in a notebook that was already half full by Wednesday evening. What the documentation was telling him, increasingly, was that the car had been in one very bad accident and had then been, and this was the part that kept stopping him, deliberately made to look worse than it was. That was a hard conclusion to reach, and he reached it carefully. But the evidence was there. In the areas of the car farthest from the primary collision damage, the rear sections, the lower panels on the passenger side, the rust was wrong, not in kind, but in distribution. True corrosion, the kind that accumulated over decades of neglect and exposure, spread from the inside out. It started in seams and drain channels and worked outward. What he was finding on portions of this car was rust that was heaviest on the surface, concentrated in specific areas, with cleaner metal beneath. Not everywhere, but in enough places that it wasn't coincidence. Someone had treated this car. Not recently, not professionally, but at some point in its past, someone had applied something, acid, likely, or a chemical accelerant, to specific areas of the bodywork to advance the appearance of deterioration. He sat on his stool and looked at that for a long time. You did that to a car for one reason. You did it to make the car look like less than it was, to obscure its condition, to ensure that anyone who looked at it casually, at an auction preview, say, in a far corner under bad lighting, would see a wreck and keep walking, which meant someone had known what it was, and had very deliberately made sure no one else would figure it out. Ray arrived Thursday at 7:30 in the evening with his equipment case, a bag of takeout Thai food, and the specific expression he wore when he was turning something over in his mind and hadn't yet decided what it was. They ate at the work table, pad see eat you out of containers, with chopsticks that Ray had brought because Grayson never had them. And Grayson told him about the rust. Ray listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Grayson finished, Ray set down his chopsticks and looked at the car. "Show me," he said. Grayson walked him through the areas he'd tagged. Ray crouched and looked and touched and said nothing for a long time. Then he stood up and put his hands in his pockets. "You're right," Ray said. "That's not natural corrosion." "No." "Which means someone did this intentionally. Someone who knew what they had and didn't want anyone else to know." Ray turned this over visibly. "Or someone who was paid to make it look like something it wasn't." "Same thing, more or less." "No, actually it's not." Ray looked at him. "If it's the owner, it's concealment. If it's a hired hand, it's fraud. The distinction matters for what happens next." Grayson hadn't fully thought through that distinction yet, and the fact that Ray had gone straight to it reminded him why he'd called Ray in the first place. "What do you think?" Grayson asked. "I think a private owner who'd held this car for 40 years and wanted to keep holding it would have stored it better. The condition, the genuine damage, the legitimate neglect, that's not a car that was being protected. That's a car that was being stored carelessly and then prepared for sale in a way that was designed to disguise its identity." Ray paused. "Someone who knew what this was brought it to a sale. They disguised it. They submitted documentation designed to describe a generic wreck, and they put it in a room full of sophisticated buyers expecting nobody to look closely enough." "They were almost right," Grayson said. "They were almost right," Ray agreed. They stood with that for a moment. "Friday morning," Grayson said. 7 o'clock. I'll need full access to the firewall area, and I need at least 3 hours uninterrupted." "You've got it." Meanwhile, in the Harwick Group's 14th floor offices, Vanessa Sterling was having a different kind of Thursday. Her authentication director, a deliberate, careful woman named Joanna Park, who had been with the company for 11 years and whom Vanessa trusted precisely because she was not the kind of person who panicked, had come to her office at 9 in the morning, closed the door, and said, "We need to talk about the Caldwell submission." Vanessa had been expecting this, or something like it. She'd been looking at the Caldwell documents herself for 3 days, and she had the specific feeling, familiar from years of running a business where small problems could become very large ones very quickly, that she was looking at something that was not yet fully revealed. "Tell me what you found," Vanessa said. Joanna sat across from her and opened a folder. She was a methodical woman who organized her findings before she presented them, which Vanessa normally appreciated, and which right now she found slightly maddening because she wanted Joanna to just start talking. "The registration document number in the Caldwell Provenance Attestation," Joanna said, "doesn't correspond to any issuing authority we can identify. I've contacted our counterparts at 3 European registries, German, Austrian, and Belgian, and none of them can locate the document number in their systems." Vanessa said nothing. She kept her face neutral. "That could mean the number was entered incorrectly," Joanna continued. "Transcription errors happen, especially with European alphanumeric sequences that don't map cleanly to our formatting standards. So I went back to Caldwell directly and asked them to verify the source document. And they said the document had been provided by the estate agent representing the seller, and they forwarded it to me." Joanna turned to a page in her folder. "This is what they sent." She placed a document on Vanessa's desk. It was a scan of what appeared to be a European registration record, in German, dated 1978. "I had this translated," Joanna said. "The document describes a vehicle. The make, model, and year are consistent with the Caldwell submission. However," she indicated a section near the bottom of the page. "This serial number here." Vanessa looked at it. "That serial number format," Joanna said carefully, "was not used by any European motor authority in 1978. The format it uses was standardized in 1986 under a pan-European regulatory agreement. It physically could not appear on a 1978 document." Vanessa looked up from the paper. "The document," Joanna said, "is fabricated." The office was quiet. From somewhere down the hall came the muffled sound of a phone ringing, going unanswered. "How confident are you?" Vanessa said. "Very." Joanna's voice was even. I've seen authentic documents from this period. I've also seen forgeries. The serial number format isn't the only issue. The typeface used in the header section appears in a second registry document Caldwell submitted, which is dated 1974. The typeface in question wasn't commercially available until 1981. Someone made these documents, and they made them without having access to authentic period examples to copy from. Vanessa set the paper down and sat back. Caldwell? Yes. Have they worked with us for how long? 8 years, 47 submitted lots, including this one. We've had no prior issues. Have you reviewed the previous submissions? I've started. I've gone back 3 years so far. Everything looks clean. This appears to be isolated. Or more precisely, this appears to be the first time they've submitted documentation for a vehicle whose history they're actively concealing. Or the first time they've done it with us, Vanessa said. Joanna nodded. That's also possible. Vanessa turned to her window. The October light was thin and flat, the kind that didn't flatter anything. She thought about the auction floor, about the laugh she'd let out, the line she'd delivered into the microphone. She thought about $500 and a flannel shirt, and the particular quality of attention a person gave something when they believed in it, regardless of what anyone else thought. She pushed that thought aside. It was beside the point. We need to talk to our legal team, she said. Today. Already scheduled for this afternoon. And we need to contact Caldwell formally, but not until I've spoken to legal. I don't want them to know we've found this before we've decided how to proceed. Understood. Joanna. Vanessa looked at her. You said the document is fabricated. If the documentation is fabricated to conceal the vehicle's true identity, what does that mean for what was actually sold? Joanna was quiet for a moment. It means we may have facilitated the sale of a misrepresented vehicle. It means the buyer acquired something that was not described accurately. And it means, she paused, depending on what the vehicle actually is, it could mean we're at the edge of something considerably larger than a single fraudulent submission. Vanessa turned back to her window. Find out everything you can about Caldwell Provenance Services, she said. Principals, history, other auction houses they work with. Don't use our regular research channels. Use outside counsel. Yes. And pull the purchase record for Lot 47. I want to know who bought it. Joanna gathered her folder. She was almost to the door when Vanessa said, One more thing. Ms. Sterling, the man who bought Lot 47, do you know anything about him? A brief pause. Only what's in the buyer registration. Grayson Reed, a restoration specialist based in Colwick, registered with a cashier's check, single lot interest. Vanessa thought about that. The single lot interest, the cashier's check, the deliberate specificity of a man who'd driven to an auction to buy one specific thing that nobody else wanted. He knew, she said quietly. Not to Joanna, more or less to herself. Joanna, to her credit, didn't ask what she meant. Ray Chu worked on the firewall for 4.5 hours on Friday morning. He used the spectrometer, which could read the chemistry of the metal's surface treatments and give him information about the original factory processes, and he used a fiber optic illumination rig that he'd designed himself and which allowed him to read stampings in conditions of extreme corrosion, and he used, at one point, a set of magnification lenses that he wore simultaneously and that made him look, Grayson thought, like a man who'd lost an argument with a laboratory. Grayson worked on the E-Type. He'd gotten the part from Italy finally. It had cleared customs and arrived, in the wrong packaging but correct otherwise, and he could start on the transmission. He worked and listened to the sounds of Ray working across the bay, and around 11:30 Ray said without looking up, I have it. Grayson set down his tool and walked over. Ray straightened up slowly. His back had started giving him trouble the previous year, and he'd adapted to it without complaint, mostly by moving more carefully and taking longer to straighten from crouched positions. He had his notebook in one hand and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. Full sequence, Ray said, and showed him the notebook. Grayson looked at the number. He already knew what it meant. He'd been building toward this for a week and a half. But seeing the complete sequence written in Ray's careful handwriting made it stop being something he suspected and start being something he had. It was a different weight. heavier in a way that wasn't unpleasant exactly, but wasn't light either. Okay, Grayson said. I need to run this against the primary registry, Ray said. And I want a second opinion on the spectrometer readings. I know a materials chemist at Penn who does vehicle authentication. She's good, she's discreet, and she can corroborate the factory surface treatment data independently. How long? 2 weeks for everything, maybe 3. He looked at Grayson. You're not going to rush this. I know. Because the value of being right is directly proportional to being thorough. And if we're actually right, Ray, I know. I'm just going to say it anyway. If we are right, the difference between a careful verification process and a rushed one is the difference between unassailable and questionable. And unassailable is the only version of this story that ends well. Grayson looked at the car. What about the artificial corrosion? Document everything you've found. Photographs, locations, your methodology for identifying it. Keep it all. That's going to matter. It already does matter. Someone faked this car's condition. That's not a paperwork problem. That's an act of concealment. Yes. Ray put his notebook away. Which means the question isn't just what this car is. The question is who knew what it was and what they did about it and why they thought selling it as a $500 parts car was a better option than selling it for what it's worth. That question had been living in the back of Grayson's mind since the night he'd found the artificial corrosion. It was a question with a specific kind of ugliness to it, because the answer almost certainly involved someone deciding that an anonymous sale was safer than an honest one. You didn't conceal a car like this to get $500 for it. You did it to move it without scrutiny, to transfer ownership to an unsuspecting buyer who would either destroy it in restoration, possible if they didn't know what they had, or sit on it in a barn somewhere, having never figured out what they'd bought. Neither of those outcomes happened by accident. The Albrecht connection, Grayson said. That's where this starts. The estate documentation is going to take longer. European records from that period are inconsistent. Some are well archived, some barely exist. I have a contact at an International Provenance Foundation who might be able to access private estate records, but that requires a formal inquiry. Start it. I was planning to, Ray said mildly. This isn't my first time. Sorry. No, you're not. Ray snapped his equipment case shut. I'll call you when I have the registry confirmation. Keep the bay locked. It's always locked. Lock it better. The following week was ordinary in the way that weeks could be ordinary on the surface while something ran underneath them. Grayson worked on the E-Type and the Alpha. He returned phone calls. He ordered parts. He drove to a salvage yard 2 towns over to look at a possible parts source for a future project and came back with nothing useful and $40 less. He did not touch the car in Bay 3. He walked past it several times a day and looked at it and kept moving. On Wednesday, 10 days after the auction, Marcus Vale called again. Something happened, Marcus said. Tell me. Vanessa Sterling pulled my department into a meeting yesterday afternoon. Her and Joanna Park from Authentication, and 2 people I didn't recognize. I think they were outside legal counsel. They were asking questions about the Caldwell submission. Grayson said nothing. Joanna presented findings about the documentation being fabricated. The registration document, the serial number format. Apparently they confirmed it's a forgery. A pause. Grayson, they know the documentation is false. They're investigating Caldwell. How far along are they? They've already contacted outside counsel. I think they're planning to report to a regulatory authority, but I don't know which one or when. They're being careful about it. Were you asked about your concerns? A brief silence. No, I wasn't asked. I wasn't the one who found the forgery. Joanna found it independently. Nobody knows I called you. Grayson considered that. You should probably stay out of it for now. Let the process happen. If they ask you directly, be honest. You noticed the Albrecht reference and didn't know what to do with it. That's the truth. Don't make it more than it is. What about you? Do they know you know anything? No. Are you going to tell them? Grayson looked at Bay 3. The car sat in its partial shadow, inert and patient, holding everything it held. When the time is right, he said. When is that? When I know for certain what I have. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The woman who made the joke at the auction. Vanessa Sterling. I've worked for her for 3 years, and I know her reputation from before that. She's not a bad person. She's demanding, and she cares too much about what rooms think of her, but she's not dishonest. This investigation she's running, she's taking it seriously. Good, Grayson said. She should. He meant it without edge. It was what he would have expected of anyone running an auction house. The obligation to pursue a problem once you'd found it. What you did with a problem when you found it said more about a person than almost anything else. He just hadn't expected to have a reason to think about Vanessa Sterling's character at all. The call from Ray came on a Friday afternoon, 17 days after the auction, while Grayson was cleaning up the bay at the end of the day. He had the radio on, a country station he'd been listening to since he was a teenager, which had changed formats twice and still managed to play songs he recognized. And he almost didn't hear his phone over the opening bars of something steel guitar heavy. The registry confirmed the sequence, Ray said. Grayson turned down the radio. The complete firewall stamp sequence corresponds to a vehicle registered in the production records as chassis number. Ray read the number, which is one of 3 remaining unaccounted examples from the series. One of 3. One of 3. The registry has it listed as missing status, last documented provenance, placing it in the Albrecht Estate Collection, Central Europe, 1979. A pause. Grayson, the last confirmed sighting of this car was 44 years ago. 44 years. Grayson stood in the middle of his bay with his phone and looked at the car. It had been somewhere for 44 years. In a barn, maybe. In a garage. In some corner of some property where nobody knew what they had or nobody wanted anyone else to know. And then it had moved, transferred, sold, shipped, and ended up in the hands of someone who had applied corrosive chemicals to its bodywork and submitted forged documentation and put it in a Connecticut auction house in the hopes that it would disappear again into ignorance. The chemist, Grayson said. She confirmed the factory surface treatment data. The metal chemistry is consistent with the original manufacturer's process from the relevant production period. It is not a replica. It is not a later vehicle modified to appear as an earlier one. Ray's voice was steady in the way voices were steady when people were working hard to keep them that way. Grayson, you have the real thing. The radio was playing something now that he couldn't identify, something slow and unfamiliar. And the light in the bay was the particular warm light of late afternoon that came through the west windows and fell across everything at an angle that made ordinary things look like they deserved to be painted. The car sat in that light. Okay, Grayson said. Okay. You need to contact the registry formally, not through me, directly as the current title holder. They have a missing vehicle protocol and it needs to be initiated by... I know. And you need legal representation before you do anything else, someone who specializes in... Ray. A pause. Thank you, Grayson said. He heard Ray take a breath. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get complicated. It's already complicated. More complicated, then. I know. Call me after you talk to a lawyer. He set the phone down on the workbench and stood in his bay in the late afternoon light and let himself have the moment for what it was. Not a celebration, nothing so clean as that, but a specific and private recognition that the thing he'd believed was true had turned out to be true. There was satisfaction in that, the deep, unshowy kind that came from trusting your own eyes when nobody else did. Then he turned off the radio, locked Bay 3 with the deadbolt he'd installed the week before, and went inside to find a lawyer who specialized in automotive provenance disputes. He didn't find one that evening. He found 3 names and left messages with 2 of them. He ate dinner, actually cooked this time, eggs and toast, nothing impressive, and sat at his kitchen table with his notebook and a pen and wrote down everything he knew in chronological order, from the catalog photograph to Ray's phone call, not because he needed to organize his own memory, but because he understood that very soon he was going to need to explain all of this to people who hadn't been living inside it for 3 weeks. He wrote for an hour. When he was done, he looked at what he had, turned to a clean page and wrote 2 words at the top. What next? He sat with that for a while. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was beginning to understand the shape of the question. The lawyer's name was Ellen Marsh. And she called back on a Monday morning while Grayson was under the Alfa Romeo dealing with a brake line that had decided to be difficult. He heard his phone on the workbench and let it go to voicemail, finished what he was doing, wiped his hands on a rag that was already beyond saving, and listened to the message. Her voice was brisk without being unfriendly. The voice of someone who billed by the hour and understood that efficiency was a form of respect. He called her back. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you left a message about a provenance dispute involving a recently acquired vehicle. Can you give me the basics?" He gave her the basics. He kept it to facts: the auction, the price, the documentation irregularities, the independent verification, the registry confirmation. He didn't editorialize. Ellen Marsh asked 3 questions during the summary, each one precise enough that he understood she'd done this kind of work before. When he finished, there was a brief silence on her end. "The vehicle is registered as missing status with the International Registry," she said. "Confirmed. And you are the current possessor, not yet confirmed legal owner because there's no clean title." "Correct. And there's an active investigation at the auction house level regarding the fraudulent documentation." "As far as I know." "Mr. Reed." Another brief pause. "Do you understand that missing status vehicles under registry protocol are subject to a formal claims process, and that your possession of the vehicle, regardless of how you acquired it or what you paid for it, does not automatically constitute ownership?" "I understand that." "And you understand that when you initiate contact with the registry, you are triggering a process that takes the vehicle out of your sole discretion and places it into a multi-party legal framework?" "Yes." "And you want to do this anyway?" It wasn't really a question, but he answered it. "Yeah, I want to do this anyway." She took that in. "All right, I'll need to see everything, so the auction records, your verification documentation, the communications with your authentication specialist, the photographs, everything you have. I can have it to you by Wednesday. Tuesday would be better." "Tuesday," he said. He spent most of Monday compiling documentation, printing photographs, organizing Ray's written assessment, putting together a chronological file that started with the catalog and ended with the registry confirmation. He worked at the kitchen table for 8 hours with the kind of focused attention that didn't feel like work exactly, but consumed him the same way work did. Around 7 in the evening, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't have saved. It took him a moment to recognize Marcus Vale's personal number. The text said, "They've formally contacted Caldwell. Meeting happened today. I wasn't in it, but heard the fallout. Things are moving." Grayson read it twice, then typed back, "Thanks. Stay out of it if you can." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then, "Too late for that probably. Joanna asked me today about the Albrecht reference. I told her what I told you." He set the phone down and sat for a moment. Marcus had done the right thing. There was nothing else he could have done, really, once he'd been asked directly. But it meant the pieces were starting to move toward each other, and Grayson had less control over the timing than he'd had a week ago. He picked the phone back up and typed, "You did the right thing. Don't worry about it." He didn't know if that was true about the worry part, but it was true about the rest. Ellen Marsh's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in Hartford that smelled like old carpet and photocopier toner, in the specific combination that offices develop when they've been occupied by the same people doing the same work for a long time. Her desk was covered in stacked files that were organized in a way Grayson didn't understand, but that she navigated without hesitation, pulling the relevant folder without looking. She was maybe 55, with reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain and a manner that was not warm exactly, but was honest, which Grayson found more useful. She went through his documentation for 40 minutes while he sat across the desk and drank coffee from a machine in the hallway that had produced something technically hot and technically brown. When she finished, she took off her reading glasses and set them on the desk. "Okay," she said. "Here's where you are. You are the lawful purchaser of Lot 47 from the Harwick auction. You paid fair value for a vehicle as represented, as is, no title, distressed condition. The fact that the vehicle turns out to be something other than it was represented to be is not your fault and creates potential claims in your favor, not against you. But the title. The title is the complication. Missing status vehicles under International Registry Protocol are subject to a multi-party claim process. There are several categories of potential claimant: the original registered owner or their estate or heirs. Any insurer who may have paid out on a loss claim related to the vehicle's disappearance, the registry itself in certain circumstances, and potentially a national authority if the vehicle's movement crosses certain legal thresholds. She paused. The good news is that as the current possessor who acquired in good faith and has voluntarily initiated the registry contact process, you have a strong position. The law generally protects good faith purchasers, and the fact that you're bringing this forward rather than waiting for it to find you matters. What about compensation for the restoration work? That's a separate matter, handled through the claims process. If another party ultimately establishes a superior ownership claim to the vehicle, you have a right to seek compensation for documented restoration expenses, cost of acquisition, and potentially appreciation value depending on jurisdiction. She picked up her glasses again. What have you spent so far? The purchase price and the verification work. I haven't started the restoration yet. She nodded. When the restoration happens, and I'm going to tell you that you should not begin major restoration work until the ownership question is further along. Every expense needs to be documented. Every part, every hour, every subcontractor. Is that going to be a problem? I already do that on every job. Good. She made a note. I want to contact the registry on your behalf next week. I'll also reach out to the auction house's legal counsel. They're going to need to know you're involved and that you have independent verification of the vehicle's identity. They may try to position themselves as the aggrieved party here, which they partially are, but they're also the venue through which a fraudulent sale occurred, and that gives them a complicated relationship with this process. There's a young man in their authentication department, Grayson said, Marcus Vale. He noticed the Albrecht reference in the Caldwell submission and flagged it, informally, to me, before the company investigation started. He reported it internally when he was asked directly. Ellen looked at him. Is he a client of mine? No. Then I can't advise him, but I will say, in a general sense, that an authentication department employee who identified an anomaly and reported it through appropriate channels is in a considerably better position than one who didn't. I know that. I just didn't want him to get lost in this. She studied him for a moment with the patient attention of someone who was good at reading people she'd only just met. You care about doing this right. I paid $500 for something worth considerably more than that, Grayson said. If I wanted to just profit from it, I'd have more options than this. You would, she agreed. But those options would create problems down the line. Provenance is everything in this market. A car with a clean, documented, legally resolved history is worth more than the same car with a cloud over it. A small, dry smile. You're being honest because it's the right thing, and also because it's the smart thing. I appreciate when those two things align. Does it usually? Not as often as people think. He began the restoration in the 4th week after the auction, after a conversation with Ellen in which she told him that the registry contact had been made, that the process was formally underway, and that his legal standing as a good faith possessor entitled him to proceed with documented restoration work while the ownership question was being resolved. He began it the way he began every serious job, not by taking things apart, but by understanding them. The car, stripped of the false rust and the decades of surface grime, had more surviving original material than he dared hope. The damage was real and significant. The front end was going to require substantial structural reconstruction, and the caved roof section needed a level of metal fabrication that would take weeks. But the lower sections of the car, the sills and the floor and the firewall, were largely intact. The original paint had survived in places under the surface treatments, visible in thin cross-sections when he carefully lifted the edge of a damaged panel. Cobalt blue. Not the color he would have guessed, but when he saw it, a thin line of it, the original factory color preserved in the layered shelter of a door jamb. It was exactly right for the car. Definitive. The way a person's eyes were the right color for their face. He photographed the color sample immediately and sent it to Ray, who confirmed it against factory records within the hour. Cobalt blue, Ray texted. Factory code. Correct for the production period. Probably ordered specifically. This was a bespoke commission, not a standard color. Grayson looked at the thin line of color for a while. Someone had ordered this car in cobalt blue specifically. They'd had a reason for it. He didn't know what that reason was and would probably never know, but the specificity of it, the human particularity of that choice, a person saying that blue, exactly, made the car feel less like an artifact and more like something that had belonged to someone. That had mattered to someone. He started on the bodywork. Check. The work was slow, the way serious work was always slow, which was differently slow than impatient slow. Impatient slow was the slowness of waiting. This was the slowness of process, of each step requiring the previous step to be complete before it could begin, of a sequence that couldn't be compressed without damaging what you were building. He worked on the car for 3 to 5 hours a day, fitted around the E-Type and the Alpha, and 2 smaller jobs that came in that month. A 69 Mustang with a rust problem that was straightforward, and a Triumph TR6 that needed a full mechanical overhaul but whose body was sound. He could do those jobs on autopilot, or close to it. 22 years of restoration work built up a library of physical knowledge that his hands could access without conscious direction. The Mustang's rust he could address while part of his mind was somewhere else. The car in Bay 3 he could not address while part of his mind was somewhere else. He gave it full attention every time, which was how he'd always approached the jobs that required it, and which meant that when he stepped into Bay 3, it was a different quality of presence than the rest of his working hours. He fixed the sill sections first. New metal, fabricated to match the originals. He had reference photographs from Ray's archive and from 2 museum examples of the same series that Ray had been able to access through his professional contacts. The geometry of the replacement sections had to be exact, which meant multiple test fittings, multiple adjustments, the kind of iterative precision that drove impatient people to distraction and that Grayson found, in the way of people whose temperament matched their work, genuinely satisfying. His neighbor, an older farmer named Don Settles, who ran beef cattle on the adjacent property and periodically appeared in the barn doorway with no particular agenda, came by on a Wednesday evening and looked at the car for a while without being asked to. "That the wreck you paid $500 for?" Don said. "That's it. Still looks like a wreck." "It's getting better." Don walked around it slowly, hands in his jacket pockets. He was 71 and had the unhurried quality of a man who'd stopped feeling the need to fill silences. He stopped at the passenger side and looked at the wheel arch. "What kind of car is it?" Grayson thought about how to answer that. "The kind that doesn't come up very often." Don looked at him with the dry patience of someone who'd lived next door to this man for 6 years and understood that this was probably the most information he was going to get. "You always pay $500 for things that turn out to be important?" "No," Grayson said. "Usually I'm wrong. But not this time." "Not this time." Don nodded, apparently satisfied with that, and left the way he'd arrived, without ceremony, back across the fence line toward the cattle operation that occupied most of his days. Grayson watched him go and then went back to the sills section he'd been fitting. 6 weeks after the auction, Ellen called with an update that changed the shape of everything. She'd been in contact with the registry, as planned, and through the registry had identified the relevant parties to the ownership claim process. The Albrecht estate, what remained of it, which was a trust administered by a law firm in Vienna, had been contacted. Their response, channeled through the Austrian firm, had been more specific than Ellen had expected. "They know the car," Ellen said. Or rather, the trust's records include documentation of the car. It was part of the estate collection, acquired in 1967 by the family patriarch and maintained in a private storage facility from approximately 1979 onward. The trust records show the car as an asset, but then, in 1981, the records indicate it was sold in a private transaction. To whom? That's where it gets complicated. The trust records show a bill of sale to a buyer identified only by initials, EV, and a transaction value that the trust's lawyers describe as significantly below what the car was worth even then. The trust's position is that the 1981 sale may not have been authorized by the estate patriarch. He was ill at the time and died the following year, and that the transaction may have been conducted without proper authorization. Grayson took that in. So the trust is claiming the original sale was invalid. They're not claiming it formally yet. They're indicating that the possibility exists. What they want, what they've requested through their lawyers, is access to the current documentation on the vehicle's condition and verification status. And they want to know who the current possessor is. Did you tell them? I told them my client is a good faith purchaser, currently in possession, and that we're cooperating fully with the registry process. What do they want to happen? A pause. That's the thing. The trust's primary interest appears to be establishing the vehicle's history, completing the documentation gap. There's a surviving family member, apparently, a grandson of the original owner. He's been searching for this vehicle for years. Ellen's voice shifted slightly, became more careful. He's not looking to litigate. He's looking to find it. Grayson sat very still. There's a collector, he said. There appears to be. He thought about what Ray had said weeks ago. If another party establishes a superior ownership claim. He'd known this was possible. He'd known it from the beginning, had structured his entire approach around it. But knowing something was possible and sitting with the reality of it were different weights. What's the path forward, he said. The registry process continues. Harwick's investigation of Caldwell is ongoing. Their lawyers have been in contact with mine and they're cooperating, which is good for everyone. The Austrian Trust will formally enter the claims process, which means the registry appoints a review panel. That process takes time. We're looking at months, not weeks. She paused. Grayson, I want to be clear about something. Go ahead. Your legal position is strong. Good faith purchaser, full cooperation, documented restoration work, clean hands throughout. But a claims panel is not going to award you ownership of a vehicle with a legitimate ownership dispute. What they will do is ensure you're compensated fairly for your documented expenses, your restoration investment, and your role in recovering a vehicle that had been lost to the documented record for over 4 decades. Another pause, more deliberate. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot, depending on how the restoration value is assessed at conclusion. I know that. I just want to make sure we're calibrated on the outcome. Ellen, I'm not trying to keep the car. He said it simply, without emphasis. I'm trying to do the right thing with it. There's a difference. A brief silence on her end. There is, she said. Okay, I'll keep moving. Hotan. In the Harwick Group's conference room on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, Vanessa Sterling sat across a table from her company's outside legal counsel and her authentication director and a representative from a federal trade authority who had driven up from New York that morning and who had the particular contained manner of someone who investigated fraud for a living and had long since stopped finding it surprising. The federal representative's name was Agent Carla Withers, and she was interested in Caldwell Provenance Services. The document falsification you've identified, Withers said, is consistent with a pattern we've seen in 3 separate cases over the past 4 years. Different auction venues, different vehicles, different brokers on paper, but similar methods. Forged registry documents, deliberate misrepresentation of vehicle identity, sales structured to move vehicles through legitimate channels while obscuring their origins. Vanessa kept her expression neutral. Are you saying Caldwell is part of a larger operation? I'm saying the method is consistent. Whether Caldwell is an originating party or an instrument used by someone else is what we're trying to establish. Withers placed a folder on the table. Shetam. The vehicle sold as Lot 47 at your October auction. The current independent verification indicates it's a significant missing vehicle from the registered record. Yes, we're aware. Your buyer, Grayson Reed, he's cooperating with the registry process. So I understand. He's also done something useful. In the process of beginning restoration work, he identified evidence of deliberate chemical treatment applied to the bodywork. Treatment designed to advance the apparent age and deterioration of the vehicle. Vanessa looked up from the folder. Someone made it look worse than it was. Significantly worse, which means the vehicle was prepared for the sale. It wasn't just misidentified, it was actively disguised. Withers' voice remained level throughout. Mr. Reed has provided his documentation to the registry and has agreed to make it available to our investigation. Joanna Park, sitting to Vanessa's right, said, The Caldwell submission was reviewed and cleared by our process. I want to be direct about that. The forgery wasn't caught at our level. We understand, Withers said. Your process is not the focus of our investigation. However, we'd like to understand how the submission moved through your system and whether there were any communications between your company and Caldwell outside of the standard submission process. There weren't, Vanessa said. Caldwell submitted through our standard broker channel. We had an 8-year relationship with them. No direct communications outside of normal business. That's consistent with what we've found elsewhere. The pattern appears to be that legitimate brokers, or entities presenting themselves as legitimate brokers, are used precisely because they have established relationships with auction houses. The auction house's trust in the broker is the mechanism. Vanessa absorbed that. The idea that Harwick's own credibility had been used against it, that the reputation she'd spent 15 years building had been the vehicle, so to speak, for someone else's fraud, sat in her chest in a way that was difficult to categorize. It wasn't quite anger. It was something colder. "What do you need from us?" she said. Withers listed things: records, correspondence, the full Caldwell submission history across all 8 years. Vanessa agreed to each item as it was named. That part was easy. When something was wrong, you fixed it. You cooperated, you documented, you let the process run. That had always been her operating principle, and it remained so. What was harder, and what she didn't say in the conference room but thought about on the drive back from the parking garage that evening, was the piece she couldn't control. The piece that was about judgment, about whether she had, in the aggregate, built something careful enough, scrutinized things closely enough. Whether the efficiency that allowed Harwick to run 47 lots through an auction in a single day was also the efficiency that allowed a forged registration document to slip through unchallenged. She sat in her car in the garage for a few minutes before starting the engine. She thought about Lot 47, which she kept coming back to in the way you return to a problem that had more to it than the obvious surface. She thought about the man who'd bought it, Grayson Reed, who, according to everything her authentication director had told her, had identified the car's potential from a bad photograph in a mailed catalog, had driven to the auction, had asked the right questions in the preview room, and had raised his paddle for $500 while the room laughed, herself included. And who had then, rather than doing the profitable thing with what he'd found, had initiated a legal process that was going to be complicated and lengthy and was going to result in him probably not keeping the car. She didn't understand that exactly, or she understood it intellectually, but something about it resisted her instinct, which was the instinct of someone who had spent 20 years in a business where things were worth what people would pay for them, where the rare thing went to whoever could position themselves to acquire it. She started the engine and drove home in the dark. The roof reconstruction took 3 weeks. It was the most technically demanding part of the restoration, the most demanding single piece of work Grayson had done in several years, which was saying something given some of the jobs he'd taken on. The original roofline was specific in its geometry. The rake of the glass, the radius of the C-pillar junction, the precise curve that ran from the windshield header to the rear deck, all of it had to be rebuilt to match not just approximate dimensions, but the exact intentional shape that someone had designed decades ago. He had reference material. Ray had provided measurements taken from the one confirmed museum example in Europe, transmitted through a colleague who'd been allowed access with precise measuring equipment. He had his own photographs of the surviving sections. He had the factory design specifications that Ray had located in a private archive. Not complete, because complete records from manufacturers that brief rarely survived intact, but enough. He built the forms first, spent 4 days on that alone, constructing the templates that would guide the metal fabrication, checking and rechecking the geometry against his references. Then he started on the metal. He'd done roof reconstructions before. Not on cars like this, but the physical discipline of the work was familiar. The way you read the metal, the way heat and pressure and patience moved material toward the shape you needed. What was different here was the margin of error, which was close to zero. Any deviation would be visible. The line was specific enough that a few millimeters of deviation in the wrong place would make the whole car look wrong, and he would know, and eventually anyone who looked closely enough would know, and that was unacceptable. He worked slowly. He reworked sections that weren't exactly right. He reworked them again. His back started complaining around week 2, and the way backs complained when you spent long hours bent over detailed work, and he took ibuprofen and stretched in the mornings and kept going. On the 4th day of the 3rd week, he got the primary roof structure where it needed to be. He stood back and looked at it. The line ran true from the front pillar to the rear, the specific, purposeful rake that had caught his eye in a bad photograph 3 months ago. It was right. Not perfect because nothing was perfect and perfect wasn't the goal anyway. Right. Accurate to what the car was supposed to be. He took a photograph and sent it to Ray with no text. Ray's reply came back in 4 minutes. Yes, Ishad. The Harwick investigation moved faster than Vanessa had expected. Agent Withers and her team were thorough and moved with the particular efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for because they'd looked for it before. What they found over the course of 6 weeks was this. Caldwell Provenance Services had been acquired 2 years earlier, quietly, through a holding company with no obvious connection to the automotive world, by an individual named Soren Mack, who had a history in the European antique trade and 2 prior civil judgments related to disputed provenance claims, neither of which had risen to criminal prosecution. Mack had maintained the existing Caldwell staff and operations, preserving the company's established relationships with auction houses while using those relationships to channel vehicles whose true identities needed to be obscured. The Lot 47 vehicle was not the first. It was, as far as the investigation could establish, the third. The first 2 had moved without detection, one through a different auction house, one through a private dealer network, and were currently under investigation as part of the same federal inquiry. Both vehicles had been recovered by buyers who hadn't known what they had, and from whom the vehicles had been quietly repurchased by intermediaries before anyone thought to look too closely. The intended outcome for Lot 47 had presumably been the same. Sell it cheaply and obscurely, wait for it to disappear into a barn somewhere or be broken up for parts, and let the 44-year absence extend itself into permanence. What they hadn't anticipated was Grayson Reed. Vanessa learned the full scope of the investigation in a briefing from Withers on a Friday morning in December. She sat across from the agent and listened to the outline of what Mack had done and how, and at the end she said, "What happens to him?" "That's for the relevant authorities to determine," Withers said. "What I can tell you is that the case is solid. The document analysis, the ownership tracing, the acquisition records for Caldwell, it's thorough." "And Harwick's position?" "Your company acted in good faith on documentation that appeared legitimate. You identified the irregularity through internal audit and voluntarily initiated contact with federal investigators. That's favorable." A pause that felt almost human. "You'll likely face some civil exposure from consignors or bidders in proximity to the affected lots, but criminal exposure is essentially non-existent." Vanessa nodded. "There's one more thing," Withers said. "Mr. Reed, his documentation of the artificial corrosion treatment was significant. Without that evidence, we could establish document fraud, but the case for deliberate concealment of the vehicle's identity would have been more circumstantial. His physical examination of the car provided direct evidence of intent. He found that on his own." He found it on his own. Vanessa thought about that for a moment. A man in a locked barn in a small town in Connecticut, working alone, finding something that trained investigators might have missed. Because he knew how to look at cars. Because he'd looked at thousands of them over 22 years and understood the difference between what was there and what was supposed to be there. "I'd like to contact him," she said. Withers looked at her. "The legal process. Not in connection with the legal process, personally." She paused. "I made a public comment at his expense at my auction. He deserves better than that." Withers said nothing for a moment, then, "That's between you and Mr. Reed." The call came from a number Grayson didn't recognize on a Thursday evening in December when he was cleaning up Bay 3 after a long day on the roof section. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something, instinct or curiosity or just the fact that his hands were already clean, made him answer. "Mr. Reed." The voice was measured and precise, and he recognized it anyway. Not from memory exactly, but from some quality in it, the way it carried. "This is Vanessa Sterling." He said nothing for a moment. "From the Harwick Group," she said, as if he might need the clarification. "I know who you are." A brief pause. "I imagine you do." Another pause, less brief. "I'm calling because I owe you a direct conversation. I understand if this isn't the right time, or if you'd prefer not to. Given the pending legal matters, I should say that this call is entirely personal and has nothing to do with the formal process." "Okay," Grayson said. "What I said at the auction, it's fine." "It isn't, actually."
Her voice was level, but there was something underneath the level. I made a public joke at your expense in a room full of people about a purchase I didn't understand and hadn't taken the time to understand. It was dismissive, and it was the kind of thing I would criticize in anyone else. She stopped. I'm not calling to ask for anything. I just thought you should hear that directly.
Grayson leaned against the workbench and looked at the car. The cobalt blue was beginning to come back now. Not in the paint, not yet, but in the shape of the thing, in the reconstructed roofline and the corrected body sections. You could see what it was becoming. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes?" "When you saw the Caldwell documentation flag, when your department found the forgery, you moved quickly." "We did." "Most companies in that position would have moved carefully, slow-walked the investigation, protected themselves first." A short silence. "I'm not sure that's entirely fair. We did protect ourselves. Cooperating with federal investigators is protective." "I know. But you cooperated fully, immediately. Some people in your position would have tried to manage the narrative before letting investigators in." "Is that a compliment or a question?" "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Maybe both." She seemed to consider that. "I've made a lot of professional decisions over the years that were primarily about managing perception, how things looked rather than what they were. Some of those decisions I'm proud of. Some of them—" She stopped. "When something is wrong, you fix it. That's not exceptional. It's just what you do." Grayson recognized the sentiment because it was approximately his own, stated in different language. "The car is coming along," he said. It wasn't a non sequitur exactly. It was where the conversation was going anyway. "I heard. Your lawyer's been in contact with ours." A pause. "What color?" "Cobalt blue. Factory original." A silence that felt like genuine surprise. "I wouldn't have guessed that." "Neither would I, until I found it. It was still there under everything. Factory color survives in the seams if nobody gets to it." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Reed, would it be acceptable, at some point when the legal situation is further resolved, to see it?" He looked at the car, the roof section, the corrected lines, the long, difficult work that still lay ahead, and that he was, regardless of outcome, going to finish because leaving it unfinished was not something he was capable of doing. "When it's done," he said. "Yeah, I think that would be fine." She said goodnight and ended the call without extending it past what it was, which he appreciated. He stood in Bay 3 for a while longer, in the work lights, with the car and the quiet and the smell of metal and solvent that had lived in his clothes for 22 years. The investigation was running. The claims process was running. The law was doing what the law did, slowly and with bureaucratic thoroughness, in the direction of something that resembled the right outcome. And the car was becoming what it had always been. He turned off the overhead light, left the work lamp on over Bay 3. He always left the work lamp on, some habit he'd never examined, and went inside. January came in cold and stayed that way. The barn held heat better than it had any right to, given its age, because Grayson had spent 2 winters insulating it properly, and the work showed. But there was a particular quality to January cold in Connecticut that found its way in regardless, through the gaps around the bay doors, up through the concrete floor, into the joints of your hands if you worked without gloves, which you sometimes had to. He kept a space heater near whichever car he was working on most closely, and he wore a wool sweater under his work coveralls, and he drank more coffee than was probably advisable. The car in Bay 3 was in primer now. It had taken him the better part of 6 weeks to get there. 6 weeks of body work, of panel replacement and shaping and fitting, of addressing the structural issues in the front end that had required a level of fabrication that kept him in the bay until 9 or 10 at night on the nights when it was going well and feeling right. The primer was gray, flat, deliberately temporary. Under the shop lights, it made the car look like a sketch of itself. The shape present, the intention visible. The final version still implied rather than stated. He liked cars at this stage sometimes. There was something honest about it. He was spraying the last section of the passenger door when his phone rang. He finished the pass before he answered because you didn't stop mid-pass regardless of who was calling. It was Ellen. "The claims panel has been constituted," she said without preamble. 3 members, a registry representative, a provenance specialist appointed by the international body, and a retired jurist serving as chair. They've received all submitted documentation, and they're scheduling the formal review. When? 6 to 8 weeks for the review period. Decision within 30 days of that. A pause. The Austrian trust has submitted formally. Their claim is based on the disputed 1981 transfer. They're arguing the sale to EV was conducted without proper estate authorization during the period of the patriarch's incapacitation. Strong argument? Complicated one. 44 years is a long time, and the documentation from that period is incomplete on both sides. What the trust has going for them is that the subsequent chain of possession, from EV through to the Caldwell submission, is itself compromised by fraud. The panel is likely to look unfavorably on a claim chain that passes through deliberate concealment, meaning Mac, and whoever Mac acquired it from. The investigation has traced 3 ownership transfers between EV and Mac's acquisition of Caldwell. 2 of those transfers appear to have been private, undocumented. The federal case is still building the chain. Grayson set down the spray gun. What about the grandson? Has the panel said anything about him individually? He's named in the trust submission as the primary beneficiary of any recovered asset. His name is Emil Voss. A brief pause. He's been looking for this car for 11 years. Ray mentioned a collector. He's not exactly a collector in the professional sense. From what the trust lawyers have shared, he's a 61-year-old architect in Vienna. He's been searching because the car was his grandfather's. It was part of his childhood. He spent summers at the estate, and his grandfather used the car on weekends, apparently. When it disappeared in '81, he was a teenager. Grayson took that in. A teenager, watching something his grandfather loved disappear. Then 4 decades of the car being nowhere, being nothing, altered and disguised and moved through back channels. Then a man in his 60s still looking, still believing it was somewhere. Okay, he said. I want to set expectations clearly, Ellen said. The panel may rule in favor of the trust's claim. If they do, you will be compensated. I'm going to fight hard for full restoration value assessment at completion, not at current stage. But the car goes to the trust and ultimately to Emil Voss. I know. You're not. She stopped. He could hear her choosing her words. A lot of people in your position would be looking for angles right now. Ways to complicate the process, slow it down, increase leverage. I know people like that. You're not one of them. No. She made a sound that was close to a sigh but wasn't quite. The compensation will be fair, Grayson. I'm going to make sure of it. But I want you to understand that fair and what it might have been in a different set of circumstances are not the same number. I bought it for $500. You bought it for $500, and you're putting months of skilled labor into it, and you identified a fraud that a federal investigation is now using as a cornerstone of its case. That has value. I know it does. I trust you to make that argument. A pause. All right. I'll keep you updated on the panel timeline. In the meantime, keep working. The restoration value is calculated at completion, so every documented hour matters. He went back to the primer after he hung up, finished the door, stepped back and looked at the car in its gray entirety. He thought about a teenager watching his grandfather's car disappear. He thought about 11 years of searching. He thought about what it meant to look for something that long, to maintain the belief that it still existed somewhere even when the evidence for it had gone completely quiet. He understood that particular stubbornness better than he would have been comfortable admitting. The federal case against Soren Mack moved on its own timeline, which was the timeline of federal cases, thorough and unhurried and occasionally maddening to everyone adjacent to it. Agent Withers had been precise and almost entirely uncommunicative since December, which Ellen said was normal and which did nothing to make the waiting feel shorter. What Grayson knew filtered through Ellen and through occasional updates from Marcus Vale, who had become a peripheral but consistent presence in the story, was this. Mack had acquired Caldwell as a vehicle, the word felt appropriate, for moving assets whose legitimate provenance chains had been deliberately broken. The Lot 47 car was the most significant single item, but it wasn't the only one. The investigation had now identified 5 vehicles across 3 years, moved through 4 different auction channels in North America and Europe. In February, Grayson learned through Ellen that Mack had been formally charged. The charges included wire fraud, document falsification, interstate transportation of fraudulently obtained property, and several additional counts related to the European aspects of the operation. His lawyers had entered a not guilty plea. The federal process was going to take time. What the charges did, procedurally, was accelerate the claims panel's timeline. The registry was motivated to resolve the ownership question before the federal case produced rulings that might complicate it, and the panel chair, the retired jurist, whose name was Harmon Bell, and who apparently ran a very tight process, moved the review up by 3 weeks. Ellen called Grayson on a Wednesday in February to tell him the revised schedule. 4 weeks, she said. The panel convenes the 22nd. We'll submit the final restoration documentation, the verification record, everything. I'll present your case in writing. The panel doesn't do oral arguments in these proceedings. That's fine. I want to talk through the compensation framework before submission. I've been building the argument on 3 pillars: acquisition cost, documented restoration expenditure, and what I'm calling discovery value. Your role in identifying the vehicle and initiating the process that led to its recovery and the fraud investigation. She paused. The third pillar is the one that's going to require the most creativity, legally speaking. What's the argument? That your identification of the vehicle, your expertise, your decision to pursue it, your documentation of the artificial corrosion constitutes a recoverable service. Without you, the car doesn't surface. The fraud doesn't get exposed. The vehicle disappears permanently into a parts barn somewhere, or gets broken up. Emil Voss spends another decade searching for a car that no longer exists as a car. She paused again. The panel is authorized to consider those factors. Whether they will is another question. Make the argument. I always plan to. He was working on the front-end reconstruction in the 3rd week of January when Ray came back. Ray drove up unannounced on a Saturday morning, which was his prerogative after 15 years of friendship, and which Grayson had long since stopped being surprised by. He came in through the side door of the barn and stood looking at Bay 3 for a while without speaking. The front end was the hardest part. The collision damage had compressed the structure in ways that required the reconstruction to proceed outward from the firewall in careful sequence, each new piece establishing the geometry for the next. He'd been at it for 3 weeks, and he was roughly 60% through. The car looked, at this stage, incomplete in a specific way. The rear and sides properly shaped and primed, the front still partly open to its bones. You're doing the inner structure first, Ray said. Have to. The geometry has to be right before I can work outward. Ray walked around the car slowly. He had his hands in his coat pockets and the wire-rimmed glasses slightly fogged from coming in out of the cold, which he didn't bother wiping. He was a man who tolerated minor inconveniences without noticing them. How long for the front end? Another 3 weeks if nothing goes wrong. Ray stopped at the passenger corner and crouched slightly to look at the junction between the repaired fender section and the new inner structure. The radius here. I know. I'm going to do that section last. I want the primary structure fully stable before I address the outer curve. Ray straightened up and looked at him. You know what this is going to look like when it's done? I have an idea. I've seen the museum example, the one in Europe. I arranged the measuring access. He looked at the car again. What you're building here is going to be indistinguishable from the original intent. The people who made this thing, if they could see what you're doing to it, Ray, I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. It doesn't change what it is or who it belongs to. Ray looked at him for a moment. The grandson, Voss. Yeah. You've thought about him. Grayson reached for a measuring tool on the work table. He's been looking for 11 years. The car belongs to that history. It belongs to the story of the person who ordered it in that specific blue and drove it on weekends at an estate in Central Europe. He turned the tool in his hands. I can restore it. I can put it back to what it was supposed to be. But I can't put myself in the center of that story. It's not my story. Ray was quiet for a moment. Most people would find a way to make it their story. I know. That's not a criticism. I know that too. Ray stayed for lunch, grilled cheese at the kitchen table, which was the most Grayson ever produced for guests, because cooking beyond that required a level of forward planning he rarely achieved. They talked about other things. Ray's pen colleague and her new spectrometry work, a job Ray had been consulted on in California, an auction in London that had moved a significant pre-war vehicle and that Ray had opinions about. After lunch, Ray drove back to Philadelphia, and Grayson went back to the barn. Marcus Vale called in mid-February, and for the first time since October, his voice didn't have the careful flatness of someone managing their anxiety about what they'd done. "They cleared us," Marcus said. "Our department." Joanna got the formal letter from the regulatory review. Harwick's authentication process wasn't deficient. It was circumvented. There's a difference. "Good," Grayson said. "I was worried—" He stopped. "I was worried for a while that me not flagging the Albrecht reference formally was going to be a problem. Like I should have known what to do with it, and didn't." "You flagged it. You just didn't know the right channel." "I flagged it to you. That's not exactly a channel. And you told me to use it carefully. You were right to tell me." Grayson paused. "It worked out. Because you knew what to do with it. Because I'd been paying attention to the car for 3 weeks by then. Different information in different hands does different things, Marcus. You didn't have context I had." A short silence. "Joanna recommended me for the provenance specialist track. It's a different career path, more documentation, more legal interface, less physical authentication." He paused. "I think I'm going to do it." "Because of this?" "Because this showed me that the document side is where a lot of things actually happen, where things go wrong and right." Another pause. If someone had caught the Albrecht reference in a formal process, none of this would have needed to happen the way it did. That's probably true. "So," a slight awkwardness in his voice. "Thank you. For taking the call in October, and for telling me not to file anything yet, and for— Marcus, you made the call. You told me something you didn't have to tell me because it didn't feel right to you. That's the thing that mattered." A brief silence. "Still, thank you." After the call, Grayson sat for a moment at his workbench. He thought about the number of small decisions that had led to where the story was now. Marcus noticing the Albrecht reference, calling Grayson instead of filing it away, Grayson taking the call, Joanna Park running an audit on a routine sample schedule. The particular timing of all of it. None of it had been inevitable. Any of a dozen small choices differently made, and the car would still be somewhere in the dark, becoming less and less of itself. He went back to the front end. In the second week of February, Vanessa Sterling made a decision that surprised her own staff. She convened a meeting of her authentication and operations teams, 12 people in the main conference room, the full relevant population of Harwick's process infrastructure, and she told them, plainly and without the language of corporate communication that tended to wrap these conversations in softness they didn't deserve, what had happened. Not the version that made Harwick look like a victim. The fuller version, that their process had been circumvented, yes, but that circumvention had been possible because their process had gaps. That the audit, which had caught the Caldwell flag, had been a random sample, meaning it had been luck, partially. That the Albrecht reference had been in their own awareness database and hadn't been cross-checked. That an authentication department employee had noticed something and hadn't known what to do with it, which meant the internal channels for that kind of thing needed to be clearer. She said all of this without distributing blame to individuals, because the gaps were systemic, and distributing blame for systemic problems to individuals was how you ensured the problems survived. She said what needed to change. She said she was changing it. "I want a provenance cross-reference requirement on every European submission," she said. "Not just the flagged ones, but everyone. I know that slows us down. I know the timeline implications. We're doing it." Her operations director, a man named Peter who managed the auction logistics and who had been with Harwick for 14 years and who was generally Vanessa's most reliable source of honest pushback, said, "The catalog deadline for the spring auction? Adjust it. The consignors who are already submitted, we contact them. We explain there's a process update. Anyone who can't work with the new timeline isn't a consignor we want." Peter looked at her. He'd heard her set high standards before, but there was a quality in this that was different from the usual ambition-driven certainty. This was something that had been thought about. "Okay," he said. "The internal reporting channel," she continued. "If someone in this building notices something that doesn't look right, they need to know exactly where that goes and what happens to it. That process doesn't currently exist clearly enough. Joanna is going to redesign it, and I want it implemented before the spring auction." She looked around the table. 12 people, all of them good at their jobs, all of them looking at her with the slightly cautious attention of people trying to calibrate whether this was temporary urgency or something more structural. This isn't because we got caught, she said. I want to be explicit about that. It's because the way we've been operating created a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities matter regardless of whether anyone exploits them. We got lucky that Grayson Reed was the person who bought that car, and not someone who wasn't interested in doing the right thing. We don't build a company on luck. She meant every word of it. What? The paint took 10 days. He applied it in stages, as you had to. Base coats first, built up in thin layers, each one allowed to fully cure before the next. The spray booth he'd built in the barn's rear section wasn't large, but it was adequate for a car this size, and the temperature-controlled environment was something he'd invested in early because paint jobs done in uncontrolled conditions were paint jobs that failed eventually. The cobalt blue went on and changed everything. There was always a moment in a restoration when the car became itself, when whatever it had been reduced to by time or neglect or damage fell away, and the thing it had always been came forward. He'd felt that moment on maybe a dozen cars over 22 years. Sometimes it happened when a mechanical component turned over for the first time. Sometimes it happened when you looked at a body line after the damage was gone and understood for the first time what the designer had actually been thinking. With this car, it happened on the second day of painting, when enough of the base color was on that the whole car was cobalt, imperfect in its current state, but undeniably itself. He stood in the spray booth with his mask pushed up on his forehead and looked at it. He stood there for about 4 minutes, which was longer than he normally allowed himself. The blue was exact. He'd mixed to the factory code that Ray had confirmed, had done test panels until it was right, had adjusted for the way the color shifted under different light conditions. It was a specific, serious blue, not flashy, not modest, exactly the color that someone had chosen deliberately for a car that was already exceptional without needing decoration. He took a photograph. He sent it to Ray with no text. Ray's reply took 6 minutes this time. I looked at the original color specifications for 20 minutes when I found them. The actual code is the one you've matched. I didn't say this at the time, but I wasn't sure I believed the color until right now. Then, after a pause of 30 seconds, "It's something, Grayson." He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. Sent. The claims panel convened on the 22nd, as scheduled. Grayson wasn't present. The process didn't involve the parties directly, which Ellen had explained and which he'd accepted, but which he found harder in practice than in principle. He went to work on the E-type, which was close to done, and which the Boston client was calling about with renewed frequency. He worked and waited and tried not to think about the panel, which was like trying not to think about something you were actively trying not to think about, which didn't work. Ellen called at 4:30. "They've received everything," she said. "The chair has set a decision deadline of March 15th. That's within the panel's standard framework. 3 weeks. Just under. I submitted the restoration documentation this morning. The full record, from acquisition through current stage. Ray's verification materials, your photographic documentation of the corrosion treatment, the cost logs." A pause. "Grayson, the restoration documentation is strong. The quality of the work, the level of expertise visible in the records, that's going to be evident to anyone who reads it." "Good. The Austrian Trust submission is also strong. The family connection, the history of the original acquisition, the evidence of the unauthorized transfer. The panel is going to find for the trust on the ownership question, I think. What I'm less certain of is the compensation framework. You made the argument. I made the argument. All 3 pillars. Whether the panel chair is receptive to the discovery value component." She let the uncertainty rest there because it was honest and she was honest. "We wait. 3 weeks, give or take." He went back to the E-type, which needed him, and gave it what it needed. Vanessa came to Colawick on a Friday afternoon in late February. She'd called first, the previous week, asking if it would be appropriate, explaining that the legal situation was pending and that she wasn't coming in any official capacity, that it was entirely his choice. He'd said yes, which was a simpler answer than the question probably deserved, but it was the true answer. She drove herself, which he noticed. She arrived in a dark sedan that was expensive but not ostentatiously expensive, and she parked it in the gravel outside the barn without any apparent concern about what gravel might do to a dark sedan's paint, which he found he respected. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the auction. No navy suit, no heels, dark jeans, a gray coat, boots that were practical rather than decorative. She looked like herself, he thought, in a way that the auction house version of her perhaps didn't quite. He met her at the barn door. "Thank you for letting me come," she said. "It's a barn," he said. "You're not putting anyone out." She almost smiled. He opened the side door and she came in. She stopped just inside and looked at the space first. The bays, the organized tool walls, the clean concrete, the quality of the lighting. He watched her taking it in, not in the way people looked at places they wanted to be polite about, but the way people looked at things when the reality of a place surprised their expectation of it. "I didn't know what to expect," she said, quietly enough that it was close to being to herself. "What did you expect?" She looked at him. "I don't know, something smaller." He nodded toward Bay 3. "It's over here." He'd moved the E-Type to give the Cobalt car full bay clearance, and the lighting overhead was on. She walked toward it and then stopped at a distance of maybe 10 feet and stayed there. The car was finished to 90%. The final clear coat was on, the body complete, the glass reinstalled. What remained was mechanical work and interior, which was coming in stages. But the exterior was there, and in the bay lighting, the Cobalt was doing what Cobalt did under good light. It shifted, absorbed, reflected back with a depth that flat colors didn't have. She stood looking at it for a long time. He didn't say anything. This was the right way to stand in front of a car like this, and he was glad she understood it without being told. When she finally spoke, her voice was different from any version of it he'd heard before. Not the auction floor authority, not the careful telephone manner from their December call, just a person responding to a thing. "It's extraordinary," she said. "Yeah. When I made that comment at the auction," she stopped, started again. "I was looking at a wreck in bad lighting that someone had paid $500 for. I was reading the surface. Most people do. That's not a defense." She said it simply, not dramatically. "I run an auction house. I built my career on the argument that I understand what things are worth. What I actually did was look at you in the car and make an assessment I had no basis for." She paused. "I've been thinking about that since October." He looked at the car. "People see what they're prepared to see." "What does that mean?" "It means you came to that auction prepared to see a room full of things you understood. You knew what the Ferrari was. You knew what the Porsche was. You had frameworks for all of it." He shrugged, a small movement. "The car in the corner that didn't fit the framework, you processed it as outside the category of things worth attention. That's not stupidity. That's just how pattern recognition works." She looked at him. "You're being more generous than you need to be." "Maybe. Doesn't make it less true." She turned back to the car. "How did you know?" "From the catalog photograph." "I didn't know. I thought the roofline was wrong for what it was listed as. I thought the wheel arches had a geometry that didn't match the decade. Those aren't conclusions. Those are questions. I came to ask the questions in person. And in person, you were more certain." "In person, I was certain enough to bid $500. That's all." She looked at the roofline, the section he'd rebuilt over 3 weeks in December, the curve he'd gotten right on the 4th day of the 3rd week. "You rebuilt this." "The primary structure and the skin. The original metal was destroyed." How do you reconstruct something that precisely when the original is gone?" He thought about how to explain it. "Reference material, factory specifications, measurements from existing examples, photographs. You understand the intent of what you're replicating, and you work toward that intent rather than just copying dimensions." "That sounds like interpretation." "It is partly. The best restoration work always is. You're making a judgment about what the original maker was trying to do and executing that judgment in metal." He paused. "You can be wrong. But if you've looked at enough cars from the same period, the same maker, you start to feel when something is right." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you always know when it's right?" "Usually." "Is this right?" He looked at the car, the roofline, the curve of the rear quarter, the Cobalt absorbing and reflecting the bay light in the specific way it did. "Yeah," he said. "This is right." She nodded slowly. He had the impression she was deciding something, not about the car, something adjacent to it. She turned toward him with the directness that was apparently native to her regardless of context.
I want to talk about the partnership proposal, she said. Not today, and not until the legal process is complete. But I want you to know I'm serious about it. He'd known this was coming. Ellen had mentioned that Harwick's legal team had flagged a potential professional relationship as part of their broader response to the fraud situation. He'd thought about it the way he thought about most things that were still hypothetical, not much, until they became actual. What would that look like, he said. Harwick retaining you as an independent authentication consultant. Physical examination of significant lots before submission, specifically anything with unclear provenance or condition questions. She paused. We'd pay you a fair rate for the work. It wouldn't interfere with your restoration business. It would probably amount to 3 or 4 cases a year, more if we expand the program. You want someone who can look at a car and know when something's wrong. I want someone who looked at a catalog photograph with a magnifying glass at midnight and drove 4 hours to bid $500 on a wreck because his instincts told him it wasn't a wreck. She met his eyes. I want that person specifically, not the category of person. You. He held her gaze for a moment. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. You should know, he said, that if I look at a car for Harwick and I think something's wrong, I'm going to say so. Regardless of whose lot it is or who submitted it or what the impact is on your auction timeline. She didn't hesitate. That's exactly why I want you. He nodded. It wasn't a yes yet, but it was the answer that would become a yes, and she was perceptive enough to read that, and she didn't push it further. They stood together in front of the car for a while, not talking, just looking. He realized he couldn't remember the last time he'd stood in this bay with someone else, and the silence hadn't felt like something to fill. The car sat in the light between them, and it was enough, as a thing to look at, to make silence feel reasonable. Emil Voss, she said finally, quietly. Yeah. Do you know anything about him? Only what Ellen told me, architect in Vienna. Spent 11 years looking for it. She nodded. What does it feel like, knowing it's going to him? Grayson thought about that honestly, the way the question deserved. It feels right, he said, which isn't the same as it feeling easy. But right covers a lot of ground that easy doesn't. Vanessa looked at the car one more time. Something in her face had settled. Some tension that had been there when she arrived had gone quiet. You're a hard person to apologize to, she said, because you don't seem to hold things. I hold things, he said. I just try to hold the right things. She left 20 minutes later with a handshake at the barn door that was more direct than ceremonial, the handshake of 2 people who had decided, without saying it exactly, that they were going to work with each other. He stood in the doorway and watched the dark sedan back out of the gravel lot and disappear down the county road. Then he went back inside. The car was waiting, the way it always was, patient and blue in the bay light. The mechanical work was next. The engine, which had been pulled early in the restoration and which had spent 3 months on a stand while he sourced and rebuilt the components that had been destroyed or were beyond saving. He'd been working on it in parallel, evenings mostly, while the bodywork consumed the days. He went to the engine stand and looked at what was there. The original power plant, what remained of it, surrounded by rebuilt and sourced components. Not every part was original. You couldn't always save everything, and the goal wasn't a relic, it was a working machine. But the core was genuine. The core was what it had always been. He put on his gloves and started working. 3 weeks until the panel's decision. Whatever came from that would come. In the meantime, there was the engine, and the interior after that, and the mechanical systems that had to be sorted and set up properly. There was still a car to finish. He worked until the light outside went fully dark, and then he kept working. The panel's decision came on a Tuesday. Not the 15th, 3 days before the 15th, which Ellen said was unusual but not unprecedented when a chair had made up his mind and saw no reason to extend a process past its utility. She called at 11 in the morning while Grayson was doing final adjustments on the fuel system, a task that required both hands and enough attention that he let the phone ring twice before he answered. It's done, she said. He set down the tool he was holding. Tell me. The panel found in favor of the Albrecht Trust on the primary ownership question. The 1981 transfer to EV is ruled invalid.
conducted without proper estate authority during the patriarch's documented period of incapacitation. The subsequent chain of possession, including Mac's acquisition, is found to be tainted by the fraudulent transfer at its root. She paused. The vehicle is awarded to the trust, and by designation to Emil Voss as the named beneficiary. Grayson stood in the quiet of the barn. Outside, the March wind was doing what March wind did, insisting on itself against the walls and the roof in a way that was more sound than feeling. The compensation, he said. All 3 pillars. Her voice shifted, and he heard something in it that wasn't quite surprise but was close to it. The panel accepted the discovery value argument. Chair Bell wrote in the decision, and I'm going to read this exactly. The possessor's identification of this vehicle from limited publicly available information, his subsequent investment of professional expertise in its verification and restoration, and his role in initiating a recovery process that exposed systemic fraud represent a recoverable contribution of significant value to the rightful owner's recovery of his property. Then the number. She read the number. Grayson sat down on the rolling stool next to the engine stand. It was not the number the car was worth. It was not the number a different kind of person in a different kind of situation might have positioned themselves to receive, but it was a real number, a serious number, one that accounted for the acquisition, the restoration work at a proper professional rate, and something more than that, something for the finding, something for the knowing. Ellen, he said. Yeah. That's fair. At a pause on her end. It's more than fair, honestly. Bell went further than I expected on the discovery value. I think... She stopped. I think the fraud angle mattered. The fact that without your physical examination of the artificial corrosion, the federal case would be thinner. The panel understood that the car's recovery wasn't just a private matter. When does the transfer happen? We have 30 days to complete the paperwork. The trust lawyers will be in contact about logistics. Another pause. Voss wants to speak with you, personally. The trust's communication indicated he'd like to call if you're willing. Of course I'm willing. I'll pass that along. He could hear her gathering herself in the way people did at the end of something that had taken a long time. Grayson, this was a good outcome. Not a perfect one, because there isn't a perfect one here, but a good one. Yeah, he said. It was. After he hung up, he sat in the barn for a few minutes without doing anything. The engine was on the stand beside him, rebuilt and ready to go back in. He'd been planning to start the reinstall this week. The car was across the bay, finished to its exterior, the cobalt blue catching the morning light that came through the west windows at this hour in a way that was different from the afternoon light, softer, less declarative. He looked at it for a while. Then he got up and started on the engine reinstall. Emil Voss called 4 days later on a Saturday morning from Vienna. The time difference meant it was mid-afternoon there, and his voice had the quality of someone who had been awake for hours composing what he was going to say and had then, at the moment of calling, set most of it aside. His English was precise and slightly formal in the way of people who learned it academically and then spent years making it fluid. Mr. Reed, he said, I've been trying to find words for this call for several days. You don't need to find words, Grayson said. I know what this is. A breath on the other end. My grandfather bought this car in 1967. I was not yet born, but I grew up with it. Summers at the estate, and he would take it out on Sunday mornings. He was not a man who talked a great deal, but behind the wheel of that car he was different, more himself, I think. A pause. When it disappeared in 1981, he was already ill. I don't think he understood what had happened. He died the following year. Grayson said nothing. He was standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn. I found a photograph when I was in my 30s, Voss continued, in my grandmother's papers, a photograph of my grandfather beside the car, taken in the early 70s, I think, from the clothes. I had never seen a photograph of it before. I had only my memory of it, which was a child's memory, imprecise. He paused. When I saw the photograph, I understood what I was looking for, and I began to look. 11 years, Grayson said. 11 years. There were leads that went nowhere, documentation that turned out to be other cars, one auction in 2019 where I was certain, but when I had the car examined, it was a replica. Someone had built a very good replica. His voice was steady, But there was something underneath the steadiness, something that had been held a long time. After that, I almost stopped. My wife said to stop. She was not wrong. A brief pause. I didn't stop. Why not? The question sat on the line for a moment. Because I knew it existed somewhere. The records were incomplete but not empty. There was a gap, not an ending. He paused again. And because of the photograph, my grandfather's hand on the door of a cobalt blue car and the way he was standing. I know how a person stands when something is theirs. Not possession, something deeper than possession. The car was his in the way that places and objects become part of who we are if we love them long enough. Grayson looked at the barn. Cobalt blue, he said. He ordered it specifically. Did he? Not a question, a recognition. Yes, he would have. He was particular about color in a way that he wasn't particular about most things. His office at the estate had a specific blue in it, painted and repainted over the years, always the same color. My grandmother said he'd mixed it himself the first time and could never explain why that particular one. Something settled in Grayson's chest. The factory code. The person who had stood in front of a color chart or held up samples and said, that one exactly, that specific blue. The human particularity of it, reaching across 5 decades to the thin line of color he'd found in a door jamb in a Connecticut barn. Mr. Voss, he said, the car is going to be ready for transfer by the end of the month. The mechanical work is almost complete. I'd like to finish it, all of it, before it comes to you. Of course. I need you to know that it's not original in every part. Some components couldn't be saved. What I've used is period correct where possible and documented everywhere. The verification record will give you the exact status of every system. My lawyer told me what you did. The work, the process, all of it. A pause. He also told me what you could have done instead, with what you found. Grayson didn't say anything. I want to pay you more than the panel awarded, Voss said. My lawyers advise me that's unconventional within the registry framework, but it isn't prohibited. I want to make an additional payment. For the work, yes, but also for... He stopped, found the word. For the care. I can hear it in how you talk about the car. You understood what it was, not just the market value, what it was. The panel compensation is sufficient, Grayson said. Mr. Reed? Emil? He used the first name without planning to, and it landed right. The panel number is fair. I know what fair looks like in this situation. If you want to do something with what you're thinking about, keep it for the car's ongoing maintenance. A car like this, properly looked after, should last another 50 years if someone attends to it. A silence. Then quietly. You're a strange man. Probably. I mean that with enormous respect. I know you do. Another pause, longer. Will you be there? When we arrange the transport, I would like, if the timing is possible, I would like to come myself to collect it, not ship it. Come for it. Grayson had not expected that. It's a long way. Yes. You'd fly from Vienna to Connecticut to drive a car away. I'd fly from Vienna to Connecticut to see the man who found it and to drive it away myself, in that order. A brief pause. Is that acceptable? He looked out at the barn one more time. The light had shifted while they'd been talking. It was later in the morning now. The angle changed, the cobalt behind those closed bay doors somewhere in the specific blue dark that it occupied when the lights were off. Yeah, he said, that's acceptable. See, the last 2 weeks of March were the mechanical weeks, and Grayson worked through them with the focused attention of someone finishing something rather than building something, which was a different quality of engagement, less discovery, more completion. The engine went back in cleanly, which it did when you'd prepared it properly, the reinstall being the sum of everything you'd gotten right before it. He ran the fuel system. He sorted the cooling system, which had needed new lines throughout, but whose radiator, remarkably, had survived the decades with its core still serviceable. He addressed the electrical, which was where old European cars always had the most personality, meaning they argued with you, and this one was no exception. Ray came back on a Wednesday in the 3rd week. No announcement, same silver sedan with the same rear quarter dent, same rolling case of equipment. He came in, looked at the car, fully dressed now, all glass, the interior done in the original material colors that Ray had confirmed from archive records, and stood in front of it for a long time. "Start it," Ray said. "Not yet. 2 more days on the electrical." "I'll wait." "Ray, you don't have to, I'll wait." He set his case down against the wall and sat on the stool by the workbench. "I have nowhere I need to be today." Grayson looked at him. Ray had his glasses pushed up on his forehead and his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had made a decision and was done discussing it. "Fine," Grayson said, and went back to the electrical. Ray stayed. He read. He'd brought a book, which suggested he'd planned to wait regardless of what Grayson said. He made himself coffee from the machine in the office twice. He didn't offer unwanted comments on the electrical work, which Grayson appreciated. And when Grayson swore at a connector that was being difficult, Ray made a sound that was approximately a laugh and went back to his book. At 4 in the afternoon, 2 days later, Grayson finished the electrical. He stood up from the driver's footwell and looked at Ray, who was on his second book and his 4th coffee. "Okay," he said. Ray set the book down. They went over the car systematically, Grayson running through every system check, Ray following along, both of them doing what they'd spent their professional lives doing, which was being careful before they committed to a conclusion. It took an hour. At the end of the hour, everything was where it needed to be. Grayson got into the driver's seat. He hadn't sat in the car before. This was deliberate, a rule he had about finished restorations that he couldn't entirely explain except to say that the first time you sat in a car you'd restored was something, and he'd learned not to spend that moment on a test run in an unfinished vehicle. He sat in the completed car, behind the wheel, with the interior around him in the correct colors and the rebuilt instruments on the dash, and the cobalt visible through the windshield at the leading edge of the hood. He put the key in. He looked at Ray, who was standing to the side of the car with his arms crossed and his expression neutral in the specific way Ray's expression went neutral when he was managing something. Grayson turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, and caught. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds, which was normal and expected, the fuel system needing to fully prime, the engine finding its temperature. He kept his foot off the throttle and let it idle. The sound was specific, not loud, not the American muscle thunderousness that people associated with classic cars, but precise and purposeful. A sound that had been engineered rather than accumulated. It settled into a rhythm that was even and clean. Ray said nothing. The engine ran. Grayson sat with his hands on his wheel and listened to it run and felt something that he'd felt maybe 5 times in 22 years of this work. The specific weight of a thing accomplished that had seemed, at various points, like it might not be. He sat with it without trying to do anything with it, because that was how you honored those moments. You didn't narrate them. You just let them be what they were. After 2 minutes, he turned the key off. The engine went quiet. Ray cleared his throat. "Well," he said. "Yeah." "Okay." Ray picked up his case. He had the slightly overly composed expression of a man who was not going to say what he was actually feeling, which was fine because Grayson already knew what he was feeling because he was feeling the same thing. "I'll be in touch about the Vienna registry notification. They'll want a running confirmation before the transfer documentation is finalized. I'll send the video." "Yes." He paused at the bay door. "Grayson. Ray. You did good work here." It was a plain sentence. Ray was not a man who ornamented his sincere statements, which was part of why his sincere statements landed. Grayson nodded, which was all the acknowledgement the moment needed, and Ray left. The barn was quiet after he went. The car sat in the bay in the afternoon light. Grayson looked at it for a while, the way he always looked at finished things before the world came in and they became someone else's. Then he went inside and made dinner for the first time in a week that involved more than eggs. The Harwick situation resolved itself in stages, the way large institutional things did. Soren Mack's legal process moved through its federal phases with the slow thoroughness of federal cases, and in the 4th week of March he accepted a plea agreement on the primary charges. The details of what he received weren't something Grayson focused on. That was the justice system's work, not his. What mattered at the edges of his own situation was that the plea agreement included a full statement of facts that corroborated everything the investigation had established,
including the deliberate preparation of the Lot 47 vehicle for concealment and the forgery of the supporting documentation.
The statement of facts meant the claims panel's decision was grounded in a criminally admitted factual record, which Ellen said eliminated any future basis for challenging the ownership determination. The car's history was, as of the federal plea, as documented and clean as a 44-year gap could be. Marcus Vale sent a text the day the plea was announced. Case closed. Provenance Specialist track starts officially in April. Thank you for everything. Grayson replied, "You did the work. Good luck." He meant both parts equally. Vanessa's partnership proposal came through formally in the last week of March, transmitted through Ellen in the proper legal channels, properly structured. It was a consulting agreement, not an employment arrangement. Harwick retained him on a per-case basis for physical provenance review of significant lots with European origins or unclear documentation history. The rate was fair. The scope gave him complete independence. If he found something wrong, he said so, and Harwick's process stopped until it was resolved. He signed it. He didn't call Vanessa to tell her. Ellen transmitted the signed agreement. 2 days later, Vanessa sent him a text. She had his personal number from the December call that said only, "Thank you. I mean that." He replied, "I know you do." He put the phone down and went back to the barn. Emil Voss arrived on a Thursday morning in early April, which was when Connecticut finally, reluctantly, began to consider the possibility of spring. He came in a rental car from Hartford Airport. He'd landed the night before and stayed at a hotel in Ashford rather than push the drive to Collowick in the dark. He called when he was 20 minutes out, which Grayson appreciated, and he pulled into the gravel lot at 9:43 in the morning. He was not what Grayson had constructed from the phone call and the second-hand biography. He was shorter than he'd imagined and broader, with the solid, slightly tired look of a man who'd spent decades doing physical work, even though his profession was drawing things. He was 61, but he moved like someone who'd been 61 for a while and had made his accommodations with it. His hair was white and cut short. He had a good overcoat that he'd dressed down with jeans and boots that were reasonable for gravel, and he carried a small bag that was clearly not a carry-on and had clearly not been planned for a long trip. He came to America with an overnight bag to collect his grandfather's car. He got out of the rental and looked at the barn before he looked at Grayson, which Grayson thought was probably the right instinct. Then he turned. "Mr. Reed," he said.
"Grayson," Grayson said, and extended his hand. Voss shook it with both hands, briefly, not effusive, just full. The grip of a man who meant the handshake. "I feel I know this place already, from how you described it. You want coffee before we go in?" "Very much." They sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes with coffee that Grayson had made properly that morning, not gas station coffee, and Voss asked questions about the restoration with the focused curiosity of someone who understood buildings and therefore understood what it meant to restore a structure to its intended form. He asked about the roof reconstruction specifically, how Grayson had gotten the geometry right, what reference material had been used, how you knew when the radius was correct rather than merely close. "You feel it," Grayson said. "That sounds like an imprecise answer." "It isn't." Voss looked at him. "No. I understand that completely." A pause. "In architecture, there are proportions that are correct and proportions that are almost correct. The eye knows the difference even when the measurement doesn't show it. The body knows." "Yeah, that." Voss wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "The cobalt blue. You found it in the seams. Under the artificial corrosion treatment. In the door jamb, right side. A thin line of original factory color." Voss was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather had a theory about color," he said. "He believed that the right color for a thing wasn't decorative. It was structural, part of what the thing actually was." He looked at the table. "He chose that blue for the car, the way he chose it for his office wall, because it was the color that belonged to that particular thing, and using another color would have made it a different thing entirely." Grayson thought about that. The factory code. The person who had stood at a color chart and pointed and said, "That one," specifically, not as decoration but as definition. "He was right," Grayson said. Voss smiled. The first full smile. And it changed his face considerably, made it younger.
He usually was. He was also stubborn and difficult and had no patience for incompetence, and not everyone liked him. He said it with the affection of someone who'd had enough time with the memory to hold both the difficulty and the love at once. He would have liked you, I think. Because I'm stubborn and have no patience for incompetence? Voss laughed, a short, genuine sound. Partly, and because you understood the car on its own terms. They finished the coffee and went to the barn. No, Grayson opened the bay door and stepped aside. Voss walked in and stopped. He stood in front of the car for a long time. Long enough that Grayson, watching from beside the door, stopped tracking the time and just let it run. The morning light came through the high west windows at a low April angle and found the cobalt in a way that did what cobalt did when the light was right. It deepened rather than brightened, took the light in rather than throwing it back, so that the car seemed to gather the morning around itself rather than reflect it. Voss put his hand on the door, the driver's door, the same door his grandfather would have reached for on Sunday mornings at an estate in Central Europe 4 decades ago. He didn't grip it. He just placed his hand there, flat, the way you touch something you needed to confirm was real. He stood like that for a while. Grayson looked at the floor near the door and gave the moment its privacy. When Voss finally spoke, his voice was different from any version of it Grayson had heard. The phone formality was gone, and what was underneath was not dramatic, just true. It's exactly right, he said. The exterior is as close as I could get to the original specification. No. Voss turned to look at him. Not the technical accuracy. I had a feeling, standing in front of it, that it was right. That whoever built this thing would recognize it. He paused. My grandfather would recognize it. Grayson nodded. He didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to add. Voss opened the driver's door and lowered himself carefully into the seat. He sat with his hands in his lap for a moment, looking at the dashboard, the instruments, the wheel, the particular geometry of the view forward. Then he reached out and put both hands on the wheel. He sat like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then he reached into his coat and took out something and held it up. A photograph, slightly creased, the edges worn from handling. Black and white, though Grayson could see even from across the bay that the print quality was good, a real photograph taken with serious equipment. The photograph I told you about, Voss said. Grayson crossed the bay and took it carefully. A man, perhaps 60 in the photograph, standing beside a car. The car was cobalt blue, but the photograph was black and white, which meant you only knew the color if you knew the color. The photograph showed the tone, the depth, the way light gathered in the panels. The man had his hand on the door, driver's door, and he was standing in the particular way that Voss had described, not possessively, not proudly exactly, but with the ease of someone in the presence of something that belonged to the same world they belonged to. He looks at home, Grayson said. Yes. Voss's voice was quiet. That is precisely the word. Grayson handed the photograph back. Voss looked at it for a moment, then looked at the space in front of the windshield where the car sat in the morning light. My wife thinks I'm insane, he said, flying to Connecticut to drive a car. A small pause. She also packed me a better bag than I would have packed myself. How far are you driving it? Hartford, for tonight. Then to the port facility in New York. We've arranged shipping from there. I'll meet it in Hamburg. He paused. I would drive it to Hamburg if the ocean weren't in the way. You could drive it today. It's ready. Voss looked at him. Will you ride with me to Hartford? Grayson had not expected that. He thought about the E-Type, which had a client waiting. The 2 small jobs on the docket. The afternoon he'd planned to spend on shop maintenance. I can do that, he said. Good. Voss turned back to the wheel. I want to drive it for an hour before you give me any directions. I don't want to navigate. I just want to drive it. Fine by me. You understand that. I understand that. Voss looked at the key, which was in the ignition where Grayson had put it that morning. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had been walking toward a door for a long time and was now standing in front of it and was not in a hurry to open it because the opening was something that only happened once. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first turn and settled into the same clean, precise rhythm it had found when Grayson started it 2 weeks ago. Voss listened to it for a long moment with his head slightly tilted. The way people listened to things they wanted to hear exactly right. "There it is," he said quietly. Not to Grayson, to himself, or to the car, or to something else entirely. Grayson got in the passenger seat. Voss drove the way people drove who had been driving well for a long time. Not carefully, but attentively. There was a difference. Careful drivers managed their anxiety. Attentive drivers were just present, reading the road and the machine, making continuous small adjustments without effort. He took the county roads out of Collowick and drove north without asking for directions, because north on an April morning was a reasonable direction, and the car needed road beneath it more than it needed a destination. He didn't talk for the first 20 minutes. Grayson didn't either. The Connecticut countryside in early April was that particular in-between state, the fields still gray-brown from winter, the trees not yet committed to leaves but beginning to suggest them, the sky doing something complicated with light and cloud that produced shadows moving across the hillsides. It was not a beautiful drive exactly. It was a real one. After 20 minutes, Voss said, "The steering." The steering rack was rebuilt, its original equipment, reconditioned. "It should feel... No, it's right. I'm not complaining. I'm just..." He adjusted his hands on the wheel slightly. "The feedback is remarkable. You know where the road is, you feel it talking back." A pause. "My grandfather used to say that a car that talks to you honestly is worth 10 that flatter you." He knew cars. He knew most things. He was very irritating in that way, said with a warmth that made the irritation into something else entirely. He would have asked you 100 questions about the restoration. He would have been in that barn for hours. You were in the barn for 40 minutes before you'd had enough. I could have stayed longer. A beat. I didn't want to overstay. You couldn't have. Voss glanced at him briefly, with the sideways look of a driver who checks and returns. Why is that? Grayson thought about how to say it. When you work on something for 6 months, alone mostly, there's a version of it in your head that's complete before the real thing is complete. And then the real thing finishes, and you're waiting for... I don't know exactly. You're waiting to hand it off. Not because you want to be rid of it, but because the story only finishes when it gets to the right person. He paused. You're the right person. Voss was quiet for a moment. That is a precise and generous thing to say. It's just true. The road curved north along a ridgeline, and for a moment the view opened to the west. Farmland rolling away in the gray-brown April afternoon. A white farmhouse visible in the distance. The sky low and textured. Voss took it in without slowing. 11 years, he said. Looking. My wife was patient far beyond what was reasonable. My children thought it was... He chose the word carefully. An eccentricity. A pleasant one, they said, though I think they meant something more concerned than pleasant. A pause. What I couldn't explain to them, not fully, was that it wasn't about the car. It was about... He stopped, started again. My grandfather died when I was 14, and you don't understand at 14 that the people around you are the last generation of a particular kind of knowing. That when they go, what they knew about the world goes with them, unless you find some way to hold on to it. He paused. The car was a piece of him, a piece of how he moved through the world. Finding it felt like, not like bringing him back. Nothing so imprecise as that. More like recovering a letter. Something written in a particular hand that proves the person existed in the way you remembered them. The farmhouse slid away behind them. The road narrowed and then widened again. You kept the photograph, Grayson said. 40 years. Voss adjusted his grip on the wheel. My grandmother gave it to me the year before she died. She said she'd kept it because the look on his face in it was the most himself she'd ever seen him photographed. A pause. I think she gave it to me because she knew I would look for the car. She didn't say it, but she knew. They drove north for a while. Grayson watched the road and the man driving and thought about the long chain of small things that had to have happened in the right sequence for this to be happening now. The catalog, the magnifying glass, the flannel shirt and the auction floor and the woman in the navy suit and the microphone. Marcus noticing something and not knowing what to do with it and making a call to a stranger. Joanna Park running a routine audit on a random sample. A federal agent who'd seen this pattern before. A lawyer who built an argument on 3 pillars and won on all 3. And before all of that, Someone who had ordered a specific blue and driven the car on Sunday mornings at an estate in Central Europe, not knowing that 40 years later, a man in Connecticut would find the color preserved in a door jamb and understand that it was the key to what the car actually was. "Can I ask you something?" Grayson said. "Yes." "The woman who organized the auction, Vanessa Sterling, have you spoken with her?" "Her company sent a formal letter, an apology, essentially, for the role Harwick played in the vehicle's misdirection." A pause. "It was a thorough letter. She wrote it herself. You could tell from the language." "She's changing her process. Her legal team mentioned it." Voss glanced sideways. "Do you know her?" "Somewhat." "Is she trustworthy?" Grayson thought about that seriously. "She made a public joke at my expense in front of a room full of people. And then when things went wrong on her end, she fixed them as fast and as completely as she could without trying to protect herself first." He paused. "Yeah, I think she's trustworthy." Voss absorbed that. "In my experience, how people behave when they have done something they regret is more revealing than how they behave the rest of the time." "That's probably right." "Did you forgive her?" The joke. "There wasn't much to forgive. She didn't know what she was looking at." "That is generous." "It's accurate." He paused. "I've spent 22 years being invisible in rooms full of people who thought they knew things better than I did. You learn not to take it personally. People see what they have the tools to see." Voss drove in silence for a moment, then, "But you saw." "I had different tools." "Taught or self-taught?" "Both. Mostly self-taught, which means I made the expensive version of every mistake before I stopped making it." Voss made a sound that was almost a laugh. "My grandfather said the same thing about architecture, that the only education worth having was the one where the failures cost you something." A pause. "He was not an easy teacher by any account." "Neither is a car that won't tell you what's wrong with it." "No." Voss settled his hands on the wheel in a slightly different position, more relaxed, Grayson noticed, than when they'd started. The car was communicating something to him and he was listening to it. "I want to ask you something in return." "Go ahead." "When you found the car, at the auction, before you bid, standing in that room, looking at it in that corner, what did you feel?" Grayson thought about this honestly. The corner of the Harwick auction floor, the bad lighting, the suit who'd come over to tell him the car was basically a parts car, the rust and the damage and the caved roof, and the specific thing he'd seen underneath all of it. "Certain," he said. "Not about what it was. I didn't know yet what it was. Certain that something was being missed, that the thing in front of me was being processed as less than it was." "And that bothered you?" "It bothered me enough to do something about it." Voss nodded slowly. "That is the correct instinct, to be bothered by things being seen as less than they are." He paused. "Most people see the surface and move on. They don't have I don't know the word, the obligation to look further." "It's not really an obligation. It's just what happens when you've spent enough time looking." "For you, it's the same thing." Grayson thought about that. "Yeah, I guess it is, that." They reached Hartford in the early afternoon, and Voss navigated the last few miles with Grayson giving directions to the hotel where he was staying, a place near the center of the city that had a parking structure where the car would be safe overnight before the drive to New York the next morning. Voss pulled into the structure and found a ground-level space away from the other cars and turned the engine off. He sat for a moment in the silence after. "I'll drive it again tomorrow," he said, "to the port." He looked at the dashboard. "And then it will be on a ship for a week, and I'll go home, and when it arrives, I'll drive it again." He paused. "I intend to drive it a great deal. It is not a car for looking at." "No," Grayson said, "it isn't. My grandfather would be appalled at the idea of it sitting in a collection." A brief private expression crossed his face. He believed in using things, that things unused were things wasted. "Agree with him." Voss turned to look at him. "You could have kept it," he said. I want you to know I understand that. Legally, there were paths. You could have made it harder, or slower, or demanded more than the panel gave. You didn't." "No." "Why not?" "And I don't want the careful answer. I want the real one." Grayson looked at the car, the hood, the blue, the line of it in the dim light of the parking structure. He thought about what the real answer was, the one under the version he'd give at a professional meeting or a legal deposition. "Because I do this work because I believe the things that get lost deserve to be found," he said, "not held. Found and returned to the story they belong to." He paused. "If I'd kept the car, it would have been mine, and it would have been good, but it wouldn't have been what I actually wanted, which is for the right thing to happen." He looked at Voss. "The right thing is that you drive it in Vienna, and it's loud in streets that have been quiet about it for 40 years. That's what I wanted." Voss was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I owe you a debt that I am unable to pay." "You don't owe me anything." "Nonetheless." They got out of the car. Voss locked it. He'd been given the key that morning with the secondary key and the full documentation package that Ellen had prepared, and looked at it through the driver's window for a moment with the same expression he'd worn in the barn. Then he turned away from it with the deliberate movement of someone choosing not to linger. They shook hands in the parking structure entrance. Voss used both hands again, the same full grip. "If you're ever in Vienna," he said, "I don't travel much. Perhaps that can change." He held Grayson's hand for a moment. "My grandfather would have wanted to thank you himself. Since that is not possible—" He stopped, said simply, "Thank you for seeing it, for doing the right thing with what you saw." Grayson nodded. He took a cab back to Kolowick, which was an hour and cost more than he'd thought, and which he didn't mind. The barn was quiet when he got back. Late afternoon, the light going toward evening, the long April light that came in low through the west windows and turned everything in the building warm for 20 minutes before it went. He stood in the doorway of Bay 3 for a while. The bay was empty. He'd known it would be empty. He'd been the one who made it empty, by doing the work correctly and bringing the process to its right conclusion. But there was still a quality to the emptiness that required a moment. The concrete floor was clean where the car had sat. He could see the faint outline of it, the memory of it in the floor, the shape of where things had rested through the months. He'd clean that too, in time, but not tonight. He went to the workbench and found the first catalog, the paper one he'd been mailed 3 weeks before the auction, folded and creased from being carried in his truck, from being opened and closed on the kitchen table, from the months of being a reference point. He opened it to page 31, the bad photograph. The flat gray wreck in the corner under bad lighting. He looked at it for a moment. Then he closed the catalog and put it on the shelf with the other documentation files, where it belonged. He had 2 jobs to get back to: the E-Type, whose Boston client was overdue a call, and the Triumph, which still had half its mechanical work ahead of it. He had a new consulting agreement with Harwick that was going to produce its first case in May, a European sports car with unclear documentation that Vanessa had flagged as something worth an independent set of eyes. He had the ordinary ongoing work of a small restoration shop in a converted barn in Connecticut, with its rhythms and its problems and its occasional moments of something more than ordinary. He turned off the overhead light in Bay 3 and left the work lamp on, as he always did. He went inside and called the Boston client, who was delighted to hear the E-Type was ready, and who wanted to arrange pickup the following Friday, and who asked 3 questions about the restoration that Grayson answered thoroughly because the answers mattered to the car's future. He scheduled the pickup. He hung up. He made dinner, actually cooked, pasta from scratch, which he almost never did and which came out adequately rather than well, which was fine. He ate at the kitchen table and looked at the empty section of the work table where the auction catalog had sat for 6 months. He thought about the man driving north in the morning, toward New York, toward a ship, toward a city where streets had been quiet about a particular blue car for 40 years. He thought about the engine turning over in a parking structure in Hartford, the sound of it in the concrete echoes, and Voss's hands on the wheel with the ease of someone who had finally arrived somewhere after a very long time walking. He thought about Don Settles, who would probably come by next week and look at the empty bay and say something brief and accurate, about Ray, who would call when there was something to call about, and who was already, probably, scanning auction catalogs for the next thing that didn't fit. About Marcus Vale, who had made a call he didn't have to make and was building a career on the knowledge that documentation was where things actually happened. About Vanessa, who was changing a process because a process needed to change and wasn't waiting to be forced. He washed the pasta pot and left it to dry and went back to the barn.
He stopped at Bay 3 and looked through the window in the side door for a moment. The work lamp made a circle of light on the empty floor. The concrete held the shape of what had been there. In the morning, he'd move the E-Type into the bay and start the final walkthrough before the Boston client arrived. But not tonight.
He turned off the lamp in the office and the lights in the other bays and went to the barn door and stood there for a moment in the dark, in the smell of metal and oil and the particular old wood and cold air smell of a barn in April. Somewhere north of him, on a road in Connecticut, a cobalt blue car was in a parking structure waiting for morning. He pulled the barn door closed and walked across the gravel to the house. The light was on in the kitchen window, the way he always left it when he went out to the barn in the evenings. He went in and turned it off and went to bed and slept better than he had in months.